い全国大会目指して頑張ってみたいかあの若い頃の気持ちを取り戻せたら良いのにもしよろしければ行きましょうか願いが叶う街にそう時間楽しい年に行くもしかして知ってるのやのととすがり出会う山のって答えそうかもしれない知りて素晴らしいものそれは救いの旅路だ我々の忘れおいでこれは愛の告白願って忘れましょう成長の苦悩世界を恋になり雨の合う顔と叫んで気合い入れよう恋の願うの今日の今日のベケーション今
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation, an anime podcast with Sean Chapman.
And Jonathan Lack.
We are here to kick back, relax, and talk about some anime this week on the show. We are continuing part 6 of our Kyoto Vacation, Yamada Naoko Strikes Back, or I Have No Voice and I Must Sound Euphonium. And this week, Yamada Naoko truly is striking back with her last movie at Kyoto Animation, Liz and the Blue Bird, a spin-off / sequel sort of to the Sound Euphonium TV show, and an absolutely phenomenal movie. But that's not the only thing we're doing on this episode. We also have a very special episode today because Jonathan and I are not the only people kicking back, relaxing, and talking about some anime. We have also flown in special all the way to Kyoto to join us on our vacation, one occasional Thomas.
Hello, everyone. I'm back from my occasional appearance to talk to you about how great the oboe is.
Yes, we have the oboe lover, Thomas Lack. So, Thomas, you have written in to the podcast before, but this is the first time you've been on Japanimation Station. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what's your history with Sound Euphonium?
Yeah, so you guys have talked about me, or Jonathan's talked about me a bit, but I was a band nerd in high school, very similar to Kumiko, except I'm not a girl and I live in America.
The only differences.
Yeah, only two differences. Oh, I also don't play euphonium. I play clarinet and percussion. But I started watching Sound Euphonium when I was still in Japan. I saw there was, Jonathan, you went here with me, there's this big anime store called Animate at the top of this mall in the city of Nagano where I lived. And right when you come up the escalator there for months, they had a Sound Euphonium banner. And I was like, that's a really weird instrument to base a whole story on. So I started watching it immediately, and I was asking my friend and coworker Tomoaki about it. And yeah, just really got into it from there. I've watched season 1 3 times. Everything else now I've seen twice. Still saving season 3 for when it's done so I can watch it all in one go. But yeah.
And we've wanted to have you on for a lot of reasons. All of that. You are also, of course, the composer on this podcast. You're our house musician. All the wonderful music you guys hear every week. The theme song, the ending theme. We're on our 3rd ending theme for the season. These are all done by Thomas. And yeah, and of course you are, as you said, a band nerd. You're my brother. And we wanted to have you on a Sound Euphonium episode. It was kind of shifting which one, and you specifically requested to be on the Liz and the Bluebird episode. So why don't you tell us why you wanted to be on this one?
Well, I just think it's maybe, other than Clannad, like the best thing I've seen from Kyoto Animation. To me, all of Sound Euphonium was really personal to me, but this one especially, I think, as, you know, an adult 10 years or so removed from high school, it's really poignant. It's really meaningful, and I think I see it a little differently every time I watch it now. I watched it 3 times in the last 2 days.
Oh, wow.
I have basically done the same thing with the 3 times, because I watched it, and then I watched a reaction to it with Drumroll Tony, who's a YouTuber / Patreon person I follow, and then I watched it again to do screenshots. So it is a very rewatchable movie.
And I'm not going to call anyone names this week. No talk of cannibalism, but Jonathan...
Listen to our Sound Euphonium Season 2 episode if you want to know more about that.
Yeah, when we were talking about season 2, just you and me, Jonathan, you mentioned that you didn't find the first arc with these two characters all that interesting. Well, less interesting in comparison, I think, is what you said. But so I wanted to come and stand up for these two because they're the best.
They are the best. This is the best sound euphonium thing. Liz and the Bluebird is a masterpiece. Yes. It's an incredible movie. We have talked about, obviously, earlier in this section of the podcast, A Silent Voice, and Sean and I both said it might be the best Kyoto Animation thing. And I think Liz and the Bluebird is at least in that same conversation. It is a smaller movie than A Silent Voice. I think it is no less well made, though, and I think, if anything, like, Yamada Naoko gets better every time she directs something. And I think this is even better directed and storyboarded, maybe, than A Silent Voice. I think the cinematic grammar of this thing is off the charts phenomenal. She is one of the most preternaturally gifted visual storytellers I have ever seen in any area of filmmaking, in any era of filmmaking. And this movie being even less plot-driven, even more internal, even more subjective. Like, this is a piece of, like, pure cinematic storytelling. I know it is based on a book. It doesn't feel like it. It is so purely visual, and it is so expressive. And I think when you look at it through that lens, like, this is the work of a absolute master storyteller on every conceivable level. And, of course, the studio behind her being the best in the business. It's a masterpiece. It's incredible. It feels like there's such a clear through line between Tamako Love Story, A Silent Voice, and then this. And God, the sky is the limit for this woman because she is unbelievable.
Yeah, that's basically my reaction to the movie as well. Is that it is just absolutely incredible. I think I would personally rate A Silent Voice a little bit higher, but I think you're right that it's less because it's a worse directed movie in any way. It's more because A Silent Voice also happens to be adapting like one of the great 21st century manga, and the sound euphonium novels seem very, very good, but they're not quite at that height. So it's like the combination of the source material and Yamada Naoko for A Silent Voice, I think, puts it a little bit higher for me. But Listen to the Blue Bird is just an absolutely phenomenal movie and is telling like such a small but incredibly personal and intimate story between these two people, and gets this thing of like how to express character through like editing and through imagery, through the parallel plot lines and all that kind of stuff. The way that they express the sort of internal psychology of these two young women, Nozomi and Mizore, is just incredible. And it does, I again, like Thomas just said, like, watch it multiple times. You can watch it multiple times in a short period of time and come away with more richer, deeper understanding of who these people are that we're exploring. And just as like a character study of two people, it really doesn't get any better than this film. It's just absolutely incredible. It is also one where watching it like I reached this point where I realized like how, so this is the last movie that Yamada Naoko makes at Kyoto Animation. She's got a couple of other things she does. She directs a couple of TV show episodes. She does a lot of work on the next Sound Euphonium movie. That's the last thing she does is her work on the season, the Chikaido finale. I forget what the crazy fucking title it has in English.
Our Promise, A Brand New Day.
Yes, the terrible subtitle, Chikaido finale, which is like the finale of Promises, is a way better title. Don't know why they changed it. But that's the last big thing she does. So we'll still talk about Yamada Naoko here and there. But this feels so much like I see why she eventually leaves Kyoto Animation. Like, it makes, some of it is obviously associated with there's the whole arson attack, and that disrupts things and causes a lot of stuff. But also, you watch this movie, you look at A Silent Voice, you look at Tamako Love Story, and how much Yamada Naoko's style, when she is in control of the project, has evolved and really pushed to its own thing that feels like it exists outside the scope of the general like house style of Kyoto Animation, where the Kyoto Animation has all these incredibly talented directors that do have their own quirks and styles and tendencies and aesthetics. But if you look at the stuff that like Takemoto Yasuhiro makes, Ishihara Tatsuya makes, Noriyuki Kitanohara, right, Ishidate Taichi, the like big name directors we've talked about, Kigami Yoshiji obviously being the kind of godfather of all of this in that style, they have their own tendencies, but they still have sort of a Kyoani-ness to them by the time you get to listen to Blue Bird, I feel like Yamada Naoko, like, she's just making her own thing. Like, she is off in her own aesthetic direction that is so different and so unique, and not just compared to KyoAni, but compared to really any other filmmaker in the anime space, or in any space, really. That's like, yeah, she has to, like, just go, she is like the Blue Bird. Like, she has to go and, like, fly and do her own thing and create her own projects, because it is absolutely fucking crazy how good this is. And it's like, this is a woman who is incredibly good at directing episodes of other people's TV shows, but that's not the thing she should be doing. She should be just making her own fucking movies, because, oh my God, these movies are so good.
I think this being her last work is extra poignant for what you just said. It is the Bluebird thing. It is the theme of this movie. It is the the pain and the ecstasy of letting someone go to fly their own path. Because also, she's built up her whole set of collaborators who are in this as well. Like, in terms of how the movie looks, how it sounds, with the composer who, like I said this last time with the silent voice, I think when a director finds the composer who is on their wavelength, something unlocks in them. We have seen this with Hayao Miyazaki and Joe Hisaishi. We've seen this with Steven Spielberg and John Williams. This is a thing that happens in the history of filmmakers. And you have that. You have, of course, Yoshiko Reika Yoshida, who she writes with every single time. Like, this movie is a Yamada Naoko movie less than it is a Kyoto Animation movie.
Yeah.
And I don't think I would say that about most of the other stuff we've watched. It is a Kyoto Animation group, effort first. This is where it's like the auteur is too big for the studio. And it makes sense that she would go off and become the, one of the two major directors at Science Saru, which is what she's doing now. And yeah, this, we could just go on forever if we don't stop ourselves.
So let's go through the history, and then we'll get into the depths of the movie. So the general history here. So turn back the clock a little bit, back to they're working on season 2 of Sound Euphonium. So as KyoAni is working on season 2 of Sound Euphonium, there are discussions of, like, we want to make a movie. Like, let's go in a movie direction, partially because, I think we talked about this with Ishihara Tatsuya on one of the previous episodes. At a certain point, he was like, why the fuck are we making this as a TV show? Because, oh my God. There's a whole series of videos on the KyoAni YouTube channel that are little behind the scenes, like minute-long little clips of behind the scenes things, and one of them is just a minute-long video that's a time-lapse of a guy drawing an oboe for one frame of this movie, and you watch that time-lapse, you're like, these people have lost their fucking minds. I cannot believe, like, how complicated it is to draw this shit. So he's like, let's make this a movie. Obviously, it is hilarious that they then eventually do go back to making it a TV show again with season 3. But they're like, let's do it a movie. And at that point, in the midst of production of season 2, the original idea is like, maybe we just make it an anime original movie and wait for, like, novels to pick up or something like that. But then Takeda Ayano, the author of the novels, she sort of reveals to them that she was working on 2 additional novels, Sound Euphonium, Kitaiji High School's Concert Band, the second movement of Turbulence, which is a 2-part novel, and that those novels would ultimately release in fall 2017, and those are the novels that tell the story of Kumiko's second year at Kitaiji High School. So she says, like, hey, I'm working on these, I've got, like, an outline, and she takes an outline of that plot to KyoAni, and there are multiple meetings where they sit down, look at the outline, and figure out, what do we do with this? We want to do a movie project. How does this make sense? So at that point, the project shifts to a movie adaptation of these upcoming novels, with the original idea being Ishihara directing a single movie that adapts those books. But when they're trying to break that down, it becomes pretty clear that is a lot of material to try to do in just one film. And one of the major elements from the book they were thinking about cutting was the big subplot about Mizore and Nozomi, which in the books are a thing that Kumiko is only, like, sort of tangentially involved in. More involved, obviously, than in the film. We'll talk about that in a second. But there are things that if you're making a Kumiko-focused movie, the Mizore and Nozomi stuff is a thing you could end up cutting out. At that point, Yamada Naoko is the person who presents the idea that she offers up, why don't I direct a movie that just adapts that storyline and just take the Mizore and Nozomi stuff, make that its own movie separate from everything else, and then that frees up the Ishihara Tatsuya to make a movie that is just about the Kumiko side of those novels, and that kind of, we can break it down in that way. And Yamada Naoko, in, like, later interviews, kind of talked about one of the reasons she wanted to do this is because when working on season 2, she was really drawn to the Mizore and Nozomi storyline. And here's a quote I translated from an interview I found. She said, "I've thought this since reading the second novel, Kitaiji High School Concert Band's Hottest Summer. that Takeda was digging into something amazing with Mizore and Nozomi. If you ask people who've read the book about their relationship, you'll usually get a strange response. Some people really get it, and other people don't get it at all. It's not romantic love or like the relationship between a man and a woman, but two most intimate people who take feelings that you'd usually hide and instead throw them at each other directly. I felt that you don't encounter work like this very often. And then in the same interview, Takeda Sensei, who was part of that interview, she kind of followed on and talked about her thoughts in writing the two characters. She said, ever since writing the second volume, I always had the feeling that the emotional vector between Mizore and Nozomi was slightly off, and I wanted to write how it changed. The feelings they have for each other aren't set in stone, but are always changing, and for good or bad, they start moving in different directions. So when I was pondering how to weave that all together as a novel, the thought occurred to me to make thematic use of their free choice piece, Liz and the Blue Bird, and that's how the story came together. So Yamada Naoko, very attracted to the story of these two young women who have this very weird ephemeral relationship that can't be very clearly defined. And it makes a lot of sense because if you look at a lot of her other work, there's a through line Tamako love story, Silent Voice. She really likes telling these stories about these two people who clearly care a lot about each other, cannot express how much they care about each other, and are kind of orbiting around each other. It's very much the theme of both of those other films. So it makes a lot of sense she would be drawn to this specific storyline. The idea originally was for Yamada to work on Liz and the Bluebird concurrently to Ishihara making Chikai no Finale, or Our Promise, A Brand New Day, if you want the terrible English title. But Ishihara was wrapped up in other commitments. The thing I saw didn't say what those commitments were, but if you look at the scheduling, it has got to be the Love, Chunibyo, and Other Delusions movie, which comes out January 2018, which is 3 months before Liz and the Bluebird. This left Yamada to work on Liz and the Bluebird first. She described in an interview that the difference between Liz and the Bluebird in the main series is that the main series is about movement/action. She uses the kanji do, like ugoku do, and is macro, while Liz and the Bluebird is about quiet. She uses the kanji shizuka, and is micro. So that's kind of how she envisions this thing's relationship to the Kumiko storyline. When putting together the staff for Liz and the Bluebird, Yamada imagined what the team that made Koi no Katachi, or Silent Voice, might do, and also felt that it would be a waste to end the creative partnership with just one movie. So she brought on most of the major figures from that film, including character designer Futoshi Nishia. Obviously, we've talked about a lot because he's one of our Q&A regulars. The composer for that movie, Ushio Kensuke, and then her, of course, longtime collaborator Yoshida Reiko on the script, who has written every single thing that Yamada Naoko has ever done. When adapting
up to today, also the Heike story and the Kimi no Iro movie that is coming out this year.
Yes.
So they have never not worked together, which I think is awesome.
Yes, it was a truly all-encompassing statement. She's written every single thing that Yamada Naoko has directed as a full project. When adapting the story from the novel, a few key changes were made. One is that in the novel, and this is just me going off of things I saw in interviews, I haven't actually read the book, but just based on what people talked about in reviews and stuff I saw. So in the novel, the Liz and the Bluebird story is told as one big chunk up front before you get to the Nozomi and Mizore stuff, which that I think makes sense to me in a novelistic sense. For a movie, obviously Yamada felt like, okay, instead let's chunk that up, break it up, and weave it in as a parallel storyline throughout the film. And the other obvious, really big difference here is that in the novel, Kumiko is still the main character of the story. So she directly acts as a mediator between Mizore and Nozomi. I assume that operates very similarly to the storyline in season 2, where she does the exact same thing. But Yamada wanted the movie to focus very narrowly and specifically on just Mizore and Nozomi's relationship, and did not want the resolution to spring between the two of them through the mediator. She wanted them to just sort of have that spring up naturally through their own interactions. So Kumiko is still in the movie, but more on the sidelines, which makes a lot of sense and is obviously the right choice, because just the story for a single film would not make sense to have Kumiko just kind of be shoved there in the middle. Whereas if it's one part of a much bigger story, then the Kumiko stuff I think would work totally fine.
Because it's also worth noting, there's nothing in this movie that you have to have seen the show for. They recap for you very, I think, naturally in the course of the movie, the kind of salient points about that, Nozomi had dropped out of the band in their first year and all that stuff, but that's presented as backstory. You could easily watch this without having seen the show. Obviously, there's an extra richness if you've seen the show, not just in the narrative, but I think aesthetically, in that this has a very different design and everything, which we'll talk about. But this is a truly standalone movie. There's a reason it doesn't have, this is not Eiga Sound Euphonium or anything like that in the title. It is just Liz and the Bluebird.
Yeah. So the movie was given a small release, like most of Kyoani's other movies. So it released in 73 theaters on April 21st, 2018. Unfortunately, the movie did perform quite poorly at the box office. So poorly, it took me a very long time to actually find the fucking box office because it's not like easily accessible. As far as I can, the best number I can sort of narrow down is that it made about 70 million yen. But though, again, like that number is not super clear because it's small, because it's like under 100 million. So a lot of places didn't like fully report. There's a good chance it did make more than that, but at like the tail end of its run. Because I can't find anything that is like a clear source of once it was done out of theaters, how much money did it make at that point? Not entirely clear. Just for comparison, the previous Sound Euphonium movie, which was the second compilation movie, which is the other like lowest performing Kyoani movie, that made 134 million yen. Most of their movies around this period were making about 200 million yen. If you're looking at like the Beyond the Boundary movie and stuff like that, the Love Chinibyo and Other Delusions movie made about that much. So really underperformed in the box office, but it did do quite well in the home media release, which I think makes sense. So the home media release scored in its first week, it was the second highest ranking release in the Oricon charts, which ranks every week, like how much did the thing sell? And the limited edition one, which is the crazy super expensive copy, sold 12,000 copies in its first week, which is very good for a movie like this. So it did, and then obviously it also reviewed incredibly well. It received multiple different awards. It received a judge's recommendation from the Agency of Cultural Affairs at their Media Art Festival, which, if you're keeping track, that is the third time now Yamada Naoko has been recognized in 3 different categories at that festival, which is very fun. The first one being for Tamako Love Story, the second one being for A Silent Voice, and then the third one being here. It also won an award called the Ofuji Nobudo Award, who is an anime director from the Mainichi Eiga contest, or Mainichi, or Everyday Movie Contest, if you want to translate the whole thing, I guess. Mainichi comes from a newspaper. But, and just in general, the reviews are incredibly glowing. I looked at a bunch of reviews from the time. One thing that a lot of reviewers pointed out, like what you're saying, Jonathan, the movie is very good at being open to newcomers because most of the people reviewing the movie had not seen the TV show. But that was not an impasse for their understanding of the film. So you don't have to just take our word for it as people who have seen the TV show looking at the movie saying, well, I think if you didn't see the TV show, this would be fine. Like professional critics who had not seen the TV show loved the movie and had no difficulty kind of getting what was going on there. So proof is in the pudding with that.
It does not surprise me that this movie did poorly at the box office. It saddens me a little bit, although clearly it has had a good afterlife, so that doesn't matter so much. But, like, it's a weird movie. This movie opens with a 7.5-minute completely silent sequence of the 2 girls walking to school that is basically an avant-garde short film. Like, this movie is, even for Yamada Naoko, even for Kyoto Animation, out there. I think this is like the most out there thing they've done probably since The Endless Eight. Like, I think it is so internal, it is so small. It is the equivalent of, I think, a very like intimate art house film in the US, if you want to go with something like that. This is not like a big 4-quadrant release, and it just speaks to how awesome it is that Kyoto Animation has the independence they have, that they even made this, because this is never something that you would get made based on like, let's pitch this to the sponsors and see if they want to make some money from Liz and the Bluebird, the exciting story of a sad girl obsessed with another girl who likes her but not as much as she wants. You know, like, you would never get it made under that scenario. So I'm just glad it exists at all, and that it is one of the most ravishing animated movies ever made.
Yeah, and also I think one of the things with that is the fact that they did not decide to brand it as Sound Euphonium Gaiden, Liz and the Bluebird, right? Like, there's no Sound Euphonium marketing around it. Like, obviously people who know, but even if you're someone who like casually is aware of the existence of Sound Euphonium, if you saw the trailer for the movie, you'd have absolutely no fucking clue.
It looks completely different. It's got,
Like, Kumiko it's funny because there are a couple of returning characters that look, they look different in the new art style, but they look pretty recognizable. But Kumiko is the one character that to me just doesn't even look like Kumiko because her hair is so iconic in the original show that in here, because they're going for a more realistic style, it gets flattened out a little bit. So it's just, there's not, and this is not a problem with the movie. It's just like a funny marketing thing. Like, it just feels like they didn't care to do that, which is fine because it doesn't really matter. Like, KyoAni has their dedicated audience that is going to buy the expensive version when it comes out. The movie is so good, it's going to live on in the critical space and have a cult following in that way, in the exact same way that Tomoko Love Story ultimately did. So it's like, I very much respect their dedication to saying, no, fuck it. It's just Liz and the Blue Bird. You don't need anything else. It would kind of cheapen the movie in some ways if you put Hibike Euphonium and had like a big euphonium thing and like had Tubacune up in the left corner or something to try to like brand it with the euphonium stuff. I like that they just let the movie aesthetically be its own thing. It is tangentially connected to this larger brand, but it doesn't have to be like so connected to it that it's like its life support. It just gets to have its own life as its own movie.
And again, I think it speaks to how much KyoAni, they are not immune to commercial forces, but they are more immune than a lot of studios because Sound Euphonium is a hit. It's not Jujutsu Kaisen or something. It's not like they made 2 movies. Like, that is not something you would normally see from a show that was the scale of hit of Sound Euphonium. You would not assume that there would be 2 original movies in 2 years from that. This is not the kind of show that usually gets that. It's clearly because the creators of the show wanted to do it, and that outweighed any real commercial considerations.
Yeah, because in every single interview I've read with Ishihara Tatsuya and Yamada Naoko around this stuff, like, they just always come across as so incredibly enthusiastic about the source material, and they really love the books. So yeah, like, it's just so clear that they're making these because they love them. So let's go through some of the crew here, although it's all people that we are very familiar with at this point. So the director is obviously Yamada Naoko. She also did all the storyboards for the movie. There are a couple of quotes I found that I liked. One, I just thought this was an interesting comment she had in this interview that she took with Takeda Sensei, the writer. She said, in like the question of like, okay, what do you do? How do you adapt these books to movies? She said, what Takeda Sensei expresses through words, I use color and sound, atmosphere, time, and so many other things to try to finally express. And I loved like the things she focused on there being color, sound, atmosphere, time, and then she says et cetera, basically. And I'm like, yes, that to me are like the 4 things. Those are the 4 things that I feel like she does. I love that those are the things that she kind of came out the top of her head. And then obviously there's all the other like photographic lenses and character acting and all that kind of stuff. But those are the 4 things that stand out to me about Yamada Naoko's style. And so it makes sense that those are the things that she pointed out specifically in that answer.
I'm looking at the Japanese text here, Sean, and the word she uses for atmosphere is kuki, which we have talked about before because that's the word for basically a slice of life show in Japan. Mm-hmm. And of course, K-On! Is one of the shows responsible for that like phrase coming into the ether. And so it's just, these are the kinds of, that quote I think you could apply to most of her works, and it shows like she's very self-aware of what she does as a director. Like, she is not an accidental auteur. This is cool to see. That's a really smart quote. No, she's a very articulate person. Like, she's so good at describing her stuff. And it was one of the fun things with Liz and the Bluebird is there were a lot more interviews that were easier to find. I mean, this and A Silent Voice, because the movies are really recent. So there's like the whole modern internet media conglomerate. So it's very easy to find them. And yes, she is clearly very aware of very particular choices and is very like a lot of like minute detail that she focuses on. So she's very aware of her style and how she goes for it. Another interesting section from one of the interviews, I kind of am summarizing here because it was a big long answer, but she said her primary focus was the idea of photographing their entirety. That is my clumsy way of trying to translate the term kiritoru, which I just couldn't figure out a good way, but it's like an idea that it's a photographing style where you're trying to have basically your subject take up the full frame, is sort of what it is. But then she said like what that meant for her was focusing on small intimate details like the flutter of an eyebrow or the shifting of a single strand of hair. This is something that she felt that Yamada felt the TV show could not do, but the movie could. So she wanted to focus on those like really particular details. And she repeatedly emphasized that the direction of the movie was being like peeping in on the secret lives of these 2 girls. The word I'm using, translating as peeping there, is the word nozoku.
there's a strong voyeuristic implication to the word nozoku, which also makes this movie, when I was watching, I was like, yeah, this is a movie for those pervs at the fucking, studying movies and shit at colleges like Jonathan that love their voyeur stuff. They get
Sean,
so hard for it.
I was already thinking
such a voyeuristic movie.
I was thinking the whole movie, oh my god, I should teach this for like talking about the gays. And
yes.
not the gays like queer theory, the gays GAZE. You could do both, kind of. The show a little more than the movie, but the gays GAZE, because this is a movie about subjectivity. It is about subjective gazes, and it is like so rare that you see a body in full frame in this movie. It is so much like bodies kind of chopped up by the frame, where you are seeing little pieces, which is also what makes it voyeuristic. It is not. There is no moment of this movie that is neutral in its framing. Mm-hmm. We talked about a silent voice being subjective, and it is, but it's subjective from two different POVs, and there are parts of the movie that are more neutrally told. Every single frame of this is in some way subjective, and so it does have that heavy voyeuristic quality, but of course in a really interesting way. So yes, if you're wondering, is Liz and the Bluebird a film school movie? I think so, and I'm a film school person, so I get to say that.
It just cracked me up when you have the very long scene of them looking at each other through the windows, and it's like they're both looking through two different windows at the different wings of the school. I'm like, oh my god, this is just like all the fucking film school people are just losing their minds watching this scene. And Naoko very consciously aware of all of that. It was very much her kind of because they're like every single interview I found, she reiterated some version of that idea. So it clearly was kind of part of the log line for the movie as a production. Obviously writing, again, Yoshida Reiko, she's always incredibly good. Obviously also adapting Takeda Ayano's novel here. Character design and chief animation director was Nishio Futoshi, just like in A Silent Voice. Of course, one of the main character designers and chief animation directors at Kyoto Animation. And then our composer is once again Ushio Kensuke, or Agraph, as he's sometimes known, although also Akito Masuda, the composer for the TV show, worked on this as well. And I've got a couple of things here on the music. So, as with A Silent Voice, Ushio was involved in the production of the movie at the concept work stage, is what they called it. So this is before storyboards were finished. This is not that's not usual, right? You don't usually get your composer involved in that early in the process. But like with A Silent Voice, it was really important to Yamada Naoko to have the music be super integral to the film. Ushio Kensuke designed the music with the concept of it being from the perspective of objects, like objects in the environment. He incorporated physical things from the environment like footsteps into the soundtrack, and he even went on a field recording session at the real-world high school that is the inspiration for Kitauji High School, and recorded things like chairs squeaking, rubbing against glass windows, and this is my favorite detail, and if you watch some of the scenes, you'll now hear exactly the sound, running a violin bow against glass speakers in the silent science room. So he incorporated the sounds using physical objects that exist in the spaces the characters are actually in. Sometimes very directly, sometimes like that example with the violin bow and the glass speaker, modifying the sound or doing something to create an unusual sound with the objects. But that was kind of the core concept of how he put together the soundtrack, similar to the idea for Silent Voice of putting the microphones inside the piano and wanting the full acoustic quality of the piano and all the accoutrements that come with it to be the thing that was kind of the theme of that soundtrack. For this, it was objects in the physical environment that are not normally thought of as musical being used in a musical way. Because of how deeply linked Ushio's music was to the storyboarding and animation of the film, he physically worked at the Kyoto Animation Studio through the process of creating the music. And one of my favorite little clips I saw in the KyoAni Behind the Scenes series is a clip of him and Yamada Naoko looking at, I think they were just storyboards projected up on a big screen, and they're figuring out the timing of the footsteps in the opening scene. And because you have to, if you're making the footsteps part of the soundtrack and the sound effects and all that stuff, you have to design the animation and the timing around that very specifically. And both of them, Ushio and Yamada, get up and they start stomping around the room, talking to each other, I think it would be more like da da da. And he's like, no, I think da da da. And they're literally going around and stomp around the whole room. And it's really cool. It's it's just clear there's a really strong creative collaboration going on there. that obviously pays off dividends because the soundtrack of this movie is incredible. But that's only one part of the soundtrack, because you also have Masada Akito's work, the composer of the TV show, because he created the Liz and the Blue Bird piece, which is their free choice song, along with the music that plays in the storybook sequences that are supposed to be sections from that song. And there is a whole, he designed every single movement of that song, and on the soundtrack you can hear the whole Listen to Bluebird thing all the way through, as well as an 8-minute, what if you had to take that full thing and then shrink it down to what the actual concert band is going to perform in the contest, and he designed that for this movie. Obviously, part of that is also, I haven't seen Chikano Finale, but I assume that it exists in some way in that movie as well, because it is just what this team is doing for their second year free choice piece. But yeah, so that is where you get this strong split between the soundtrack and the kind of the music that goes with Listen to the Blue Bird being made by two people here.
This is something I had to stop the movie and look up, because when they're playing the Liz and the Bluebird piece, I went, this has to be a real existing concert band piece, right? This is it passes the smell test so completely. And then I did, listen to the soundtrack afterwards, and it is incredible. But no, it's written by Masada Akito for the show. That's wild. Thomas, I was wondering if you could comment on that, the quality of the piece and how much it does sound like something you would hear in this environment. Kind of blew me away, because I guess he would have had to do similar stuff on the show, but this just felt like another level altogether.
Well, yeah, kind of. It's really impressive that someone who's more aligned and trained for TV music or anime music in this case can do a concert band piece, because those are actually really different things compositionally. But I assume he sort of approached it dramatically from the point of view of this fairy tale first, so that sort of gave it that programmatic quality. It is really good. Just as a concert band piece, I really love it, actually. I would play that. I would jam to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the programmatic thing, as you're saying, is it has the movements, and it has this, the thing I was thinking of was the Sorcerer's Apprentice piece that is in Fantasia or something like that, where it is a piece of music that really clearly tells a story. And as you say, someone whose thing is movie music doing that, it's incredible. Again, it feels like everyone who works on Sound Euphonium is putting in 150% of the effort, because they just are that passionate about the material.
Yeah, and you can tell so much with the fairy tale sequences that it is scored to the picture first. So I assume that that part of the process helps, and you do get to see a more full performance of it in the concert band setting in the Our Promise movie. So you can look forward to that too.
One person you have to shout out, as always with Sound Euphonium, is we still have our musical instrument animation director, still a credit I've only ever seen for this series, which is Takahashi Hiroyuki. I'm still doing work. I don't know for sure, but I think he was the guy who spent seemingly an hour drawing an oboe in that kind of scenes video, which still, you look at that, you're like, I have to imagine he was probably pretty annoyed when he realized we're making a whole movie about the oboe lady and she meets another oboe lady. Come on, can we have a whole movie about someone who plays the triangle or something that's a little bit easier to fucking draw?
I know. And of course, this being a movie, you look at Sound Euphonium, the show, and you think, the animation can't get better than this. And then you watch Liz and the Bluebird and you're like, no, when you only have to do 90 minutes of animation, it can in fact get better. And boy, that oboe looks good.
It's a very good looking oboe.
The reeds in particular, there is the way they just they bend, and the physicality. It's right, this is a movie. And it's a Kyoto Animation movie. Wow.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. And then we also have our unit directors here. So, this is a lot of fucking work to make these movies. So Yamada Naoko, obviously, is a unit director. We also have Sawa Shinpei here, who I believe this is the first time his name has come up. So Sawa is an animator who started working, doing in-betweens at KyoAni on K-On! And then he was an assistant director for episode 8 of Sound Euphonium season 2, and then would go on to direct episodes of Ms. Kobayashi's Maid Dragon in 2017, which that is before this movie comes out. So he's directed some TV episodes, which we'll talk about in the future. Then he directed episodes for multiple other shows, and then he left KyoAni after the second season of Ms. Kobayashi's Maid Dragon in 2021. So we will see his name kind of pop up here a little bit, and this was the first kind of big credit for something we've covered. Then you also have Ogawa Taichi, which again, he is very heavily involved in the Sound Euphonium stuff. He is the sort of quote unquote assistant director for season 3. So, he's directed the like compilation movies, all that kind of stuff. Of course, also have Ishihara Tatsuya here doing work on the movie, and then also Takimoto Yasuhiro as a unit director. So you've got, that's kind of some of our other people that are higher up in the creative process here. And then we do have 2 different songs written for the ending. So you've got Girls Dance Staircase, which is performed by Yutaka Ono, which is the first song that plays over the end credits. You also have the song Songbirds by Homecomings, which I had to double check multiple times which one of those was the title of the song and which one's the name of the band, because they both seem like they could be either. And that is the last song that plays during the end credits.
Both good songs. I have to say, though, Girls Dance Staircase is a jaw-dropping, oh my god, because that is the one it is composed by Ushio, the composer of the movie. Yes. The lyrics are by Yamada Naoko, and it honestly, it sounds like there's a lot of parts of this movie that feel like a Studio Ghibli movie. That song feels like the end song for a Studio Ghibli movie. Like, it is that kind of like cued into the texture, the aesthetic, and the emotional reality of the movie in such a way that, like, as Atlas Songbirds is a nice song, I almost wish it, like, the rest of the credits just went by in silence, because I finished that first song and I was like, oh my god, it like hit me really hard.
Yeah, because that first song feels like, okay, this is the song for the movie, and the second one feels like this is like the promotional tie-in, which is kind of what it was. Of like, let's make the normal thing of like, let's make a deal with this like J-pop group and have them make a song and help promote it, and they have a single and all that kind of stuff. And it's fine, but there is a purity to Girls Dance Staircase, including the fact that it's all lowercase, and there's no space between the commas. Just like all I'm very particular about my how they format all these titles for these things. And
we have to talk for a second about how Kensuke Ushio does his soundtracks, because they're ludicrous. The one for Liz and the Bluebird has the title in German for reasons I do not know or understand. The Silent Voice soundtrack is not called the Silent Voice soundtrack. All the track names are super fucking weird. That dude wants you to know that he is an avant-garde music composer, and he very much is.
Yes, but yeah, I love all the, he's got his own style. He is clearly like, he is a very like artistic person by nature, and I want to respect his choice to just have everything be lowercase, not put spaces between commas. Even if the no space between commas thing does slowly drive me insane when I look at it over and over again. Yeah. All right, so that's my whole preamble here. There's, as with A Silent Voice, it's just there's a lot of shit written about these movies, so it's just really easy to get access to it, because like I went through a lot of interviews and honestly trimmed down a lot of the stuff I put in to the preamble, because there are a lot of very academic types that really like this film.
Absolutely, I am one of them now. I will absolutely be working this into the syllabus of something when I am teaching again, because I think you could put this in, a lot of different buckets, including like if you're just teaching animation in general. This movie is a really, really good example of something where, is there anything in the subject matter strictly that has to be animated? No. You could film everything in this movie with a motion picture camera. That's fine. But could you tell this story in live action genuinely? And I don't think so. I think this movie is too about subjective experience. I think it is too about being in someone's head. And I do think, as much as there's a lot of great, first-person cinema and movies that do all sorts of things to confer subjectivity, I think the specific thing this movie is going for, I don't think you can do really in any other medium. And I think it is a really interesting way of looking at animation through a lens that it is not often, especially in Western scholarship and discussion, looked at enough. Especially because this movie is actively in conversation with animation history itself. Yes. Because one side of the movie is the side story, the fairy tale, which is drawn like an episode of World Masterpiece Theater. It looks like Heidi Girl of the Alps. It looks like Anne of Green Gables. It is the Isao Takahata kind of show, the kind of thing that Hayao Miyazaki, who I've compared Yamada Naoko to on that kind of wunderkind level, cut his teeth on. And of course it has a certain Ghibli aesthetic too, because it is all watercolors. And so the way this movie is in conversation with different kinds of animation, and is also in conversation because it has a different character designer and a different set of character designs than Sound Euphonium. So it is doing something that I think in a Western context would be very radical, which is continuing the same overall canon of the story, but with a extremely different animation style, which I love. This animation style is even more sort of to my taste personally. It's a little closer to something like Mamoru Hosoda in that the characters are lankier. They're a little the designs are like they use thinner line work and stuff like that. So they're a little more fluid. But like all of that also puts it in this kind of active conversation about what animation is in a really fascinating way.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it is, as you say, it is a movie that nothing that happens in it is like actually fantastical other than the one shot of a bird turning into a girl. Like if you're doing the live action thing, that's your one effect shot, right? But the nature of what they're doing with the characters and the perspective here is you can't really ask actors to do what you're doing with these shots with these characters. It's just, you can't turn actors into puppets on a string for you. And so the movements of characters, the way that their eye line shifts, the way it's like what Yamada Naoko said in her quote in that one interview, like the way a single strand of hair falls off of a shoulder. All those things are so particularly designed to give you insight into who these people are, what they're feeling, what are they thinking in those moments, and how that changes through the film. And that is something that animation can do because every single one of those movements is designed particularly by an artist to convey that very specific feeling. And so it's what creates this as this purely rich character study for these two people that also, I think, reflects in a way that's so interesting on the TV show, because I think your understanding of who Nozomi and Mizore are evolves, it deepens so much, and it's so much richer, particularly for Nozomi, I think, who it just has some really challenging material for her character in this film. And all that stuff is expressed in such a way that only really animation could do it.
Yeah. And, it is not just that you can't ask actors to do it, Sean. It's that there are no repeated shot setups in this movie. There are no repeated camera setups. There's no shot reverse shot. There is no we're planting the cameras and having the actors do this. Every shot of this movie is bespoke. There are so many shots that it is definitely, the camera feels rooted. It does the Yamada Naoko thing where there's a little bit of wobble to the camera at times to feel like it is handheld. But a lot of this would be really hard and awkward to shoot with a camera because you're putting it on the floor, you're putting it on the ceiling, you're doing, soft focus over a chair on their head, you're doing a little shot on their, on a strand of hair waving in the breeze. There's so many things where the camera is able to be kind of invasive and voyeuristic above and beyond what you can actually do with a camera, just practically speaking. You could, but to shoot this movie with this storyboarding and live action would be a Herculean undertaking in terms of just time and effort. Again, you could, but you probably wouldn't. And that is another thing that this movie, and I think we've said this about all of Yamada Naoko's movies so far, because when she is storyboarding, and I think as she gets older, she's still not old, but as she gets older, I think her storyboards get more and more complicated on that degree, and it is really, really striking.
Absolutely.
Japanimation Station.
Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can support the show directly on Ko-fi at the link in the description. And remember to check out the Weekly Stuff podcast, our long-running series on movies and video games and everything else on all platforms.
And now, back to the show. How do we want to start diving into this thing?
Let's let we've been talking. Thomas, what do you want to say about this movie? Why you love it so much? What made you want to come on this podcast? What it reflects on your experience as a band person. I'm adjacent as an orchestra person, but I wasn't as into it as you are. Sean is a loner he was in debate club, which is just a different thing.
I played the guitar. I'm cool. I'm not like cool. You nerds.
Yeah. Indeed. So, yeah.
I will say, the culture for a string orchestra versus a band in high school is very different. So I don't think you are on the outskirts. I think you just had something different, Jonathan. You asked me once about season 1, when Reina says you can talk to me once you've surpassed me, and you're like, is this something realistic? And I was like, that's nothing in band drama. That's like a Tuesday. Band is much more dramatic, in part because there are way more instruments and they're way different. And it gets tough to talk about. There are stereotypes for the types of people that play certain instruments, and yeah, they're stereotypes, but there are certain things that are true about them. Like, especially in school, flute is predominantly girls. In symphony orchestras, you that doesn't really matter as much at the professional level. Clarinets are very like mixed, girls and boys. Percussion's usually a lot more boys, especially when they're younger. And euphonium is this weird instrument that just attracts crazy people sometimes.
Yeah, well, as we know well from watching the show, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that's very true.
Like it is like Kumiko, it is something about this show. She starts out looking like your kind of milquetoast normal protagonist, and you realize, oh, Kumiko is a nut job by the end of season 2. Like, she's weird. That is why Asuka says to her, like, yeah, you are such a euphonium, and it's true.
Yeah. Yeah, so they nail that. But about this movie more specifically, I do want to briefly just talk about the relationship between flute and oboe, actually. I don't necessarily think it's key to understanding this movie, but I think it does sort of reveal some things about these two characters' relationship that's kind of interesting. If you look at a score, there's something called score order, which is just the order in which instruments are listed from top to bottom. It starts with woodwinds, then brass, then percussion, then strings. And they're kind of in order from like highest instrument to lowest instrument, but the first two on there are going to be the flute family and the oboe family. So they're right next to each other because they're the highest. If there's a piccolo, that'll be above the flutes, but that's sort of part of the flute family. And they're essentially very different takes on the exact same idea. So the fingerings for both instruments, that is, if you want to play the note D, you use the same buttons essentially on the oboe as you do on the flute. Other than that, though, they're completely different and very unique as far as woodwinds goes. That obviously the concert flute is played on the side as opposed to directly in front of you coming down like all the rest of the woodwinds are. It's also the only woodwind instrument that doesn't have a reed. That's the wooden thing that for oboe, there's two of them. They vibrate against each other. It's called a double reed. For clarinets and saxophones, it's a reed against a mouthpiece. So they call that single reeds. So obviously the flute is also metal, whereas the oboe's wood. But they also have this sort of very complementary timbre of each other, where the flute is this very sort of pure, sort of piercing sound because of how high it is, not because it's a harsh sound, just because it is so high. And it sort of has this delicate quality in the lower register, whereas the oboe is this, if it's played correctly and well, which is really difficult, it's a really, really complex timbre that's kind of difficult to understand. I think in the second season of Sound Euphonium, someone says it sort of sounds like a beautiful woman singing, and that's kind of true, but to me it sounds more like how crying feels, that it's this very complicated sound that it's not just sad, but it can also be happy or joyful. But there's a lot of complexity and depth to the sound. So again, I don't think that's necessarily like a key point they were thinking about when they were, conceiving the story. But it is interesting to sort of look at these characters as sort of having that kind of relationship, that they're very, very different, but part of them kind of wants the same thing.
Well, I suspect that was for the author talking to Ayano. I bet that is, who was in band. I bet that she did think through, okay, I want to create these two characters that have that kind of relationship that is expressed through the instruments, because that is how she designs most of the characters feel reflective of their instruments. Like how, you've got like Sapphire, who is the only person on a string instrument, until we have mysterious harp girl in this movie. I was like, where did they get this harp from? Oh my God, I've got to watch the movie, the next movie to know where harp girl comes from. But, Sapphire, who is this just like insane person, who's the only person on a string instrument in this whole band. And you've got, obviously we had already talked about like Kumiko and the euphonium. And I do feel like there is a sense of wanting these instruments to reflect these, people, in that way in which the oboe is a really difficult instrument to play. I think like really reflects a lot about Mizore as a person and how she is, until you get this Didika character in this film. She's the only person who's playing the oboe. She's always off on her own to the side, just practicing her instrument, because she doesn't even really have like a section to perform with. It is just her.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. Like it takes so much work to get the oboe to sound like beginner level versus other instruments. mastery, I think, is a little more comparable, but like just to get it to sound good enough for anything is so much more difficult than pretty much any other instrument. Maybe the horn is like the only brass instrument that comes close, kind of.
You get that a little bit in this movie, this sense that there's the underclassman that she's, or is trying to be her friend, Ririka, that you were just talking about, Sean. Like, you get the sense that Ririka is very committed and probably is good at this, but you also get the revelation in the middle of the movie that she didn't pass the auditions. And I don't think the implication there is that she is bad at it. I think the implication is that the oboe is really hard. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is the feeling that I get from Ririka.
Yeah, she's the MVP of this movie as far as I'm concerned. They have that scene where she finally gets Mizore to sort of take her wall down a little bit when she engages her not on like doing a social activity, but on reed making, which is something that even like intermediate level oboists will do, is they don't just buy reeds like clarinets and saxophones. They have to make them because...
I wanted to ask you about this, Thomas. I'm sure Sean did too. I have not seen that before, and it fascinated me. And I was like, oh, clearly KyoAni had to go do some research on this one because it's so detailed. It looks like she's making fishing tackle almost, is the only thing I can compare it to. But like there's a similarity there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and like for clarinet, I have like a reed knife and sandpaper that I use, but like you need so much stuff just to get, even if you buy reeds and you want to modify them to be good for you, double reeds specifically, you need to spend like so much time on them. Even then, like, especially like I live in Colorado, sometimes they just don't fucking work because it's too dry here. You'll see they also, in this one, she upgraded from wetting it in her mouth to having a pill bottle to wet it in. Sometimes you just leave it in that for like ever, basically. Like you might just leave it in there for an hour before a performance just to make sure it's the proper humidity or something. Yeah, reeds are really complicated, and I think it's interesting that that's what she sort of bonds with Ririka on. And then they get to play this duet together, and sort of she has this soft smile, Ririka does, where she's just like so happy to be playing oboe with someone and to be bonding in this way. And I think that's one of the reasons, like just those little moments where you get to see like what playing music and what the joys of that are really like. And that's not captured in other media that portray this kind of thing. And I know you guys have talked about it. Like there's the accuracy of the performance and everyone's breathing and fingering in the right place. But there's also the accuracy of how it actually feels when you get to do this kind of thing and you're really into it. And this movie, I think, winds up capturing that and its complexities a lot more than even the show or the other movie gets to, just because of how laser focused it is.
This is something I kind of missed in season 2 when we talked about, and not necessarily this is a criticism of season 2. As you pointed out to me, Thomas, season 2, we're at a point in their school year where we're not, like, the form isn't as important as them practicing just kind of this piece over and over. But, like, with this movie, we're back to some of the stuff in season 1 that's more the procedural, like, how do you practice the instrument? There's the stuff about the reed making. It's all that like little nitty gritty details that I really like seeing, and that like is the reason KyoAni is the people who had to do sound euphonium, because they're into the nitty gritty details. And I liked seeing that in this one, especially because we're only focusing on 2 instruments in this movie. You get a lot of that.
Yeah, like in season 2, I think this might be even too tedious for Kyoto Animation, but they could do like a whole episode of like rehearsing when you're just in the minute details and like, you know, the trombones aren't quite together, so you have to go start that again. And then the euphoniums are a little flat, so they need to do it 3 times to make sure that they have it down, that they have it in their ear. And then the percussionists are a little too quiet, so they gotta, you know, play a little more away from the edge of the drum towards the center of the drum, maybe. And the cymbal roll is swelling a little too, or like that's the kind of thing that they would be rehearsing in like the season 2.
And the problem with that is you'd have an entire episode just set in the music room and all the animators would die. Because it's like it'd be a whole episode just of them drawing instruments the entire time. They're like, please, for the love of God, stop.
But it's like they're so good at like the drama of like when, you know, it's focused on Kumiko. So when she can't get that part down and like the heartbreak of when Taki Sensei says, for this competition, you're not going to play that part. They're so good at like the drama of that. And in this movie, especially the scene at the end, that's not a performance. It's just practicing when Mizore sort of has her breakthrough on the solo. Just the emotions of like how rare that moment is for not just the 2 that are like directly involved, but the whole band can feel it. They do that so well. And that's one thing I wish they could do a little more of. Like they could do a whole episode of practice like that. It would be so tedious, and I don't know like if that meaning would be lost on people that haven't lived through it like I have. That's sort of a question I've always had about this, is like, how well does the impact of all this translate to people that haven't lived directly this, but have lived, the high school drama of something else?
I think that they're very good at tying everything in fundamentally into like these characters' personalities, right? And so it's like they're represented through these specific instruments and these specific musical pieces and these performances, but it's all rooted in something very purely human. And it's just, it's like you could express these same ideas in any other kind of like hobby that these characters have or art form that they're expressing. I think music is particularly really expressive, so it works super well. I think it's also incredibly hard to animate, so it's something that a lot of other studios wouldn't really want to go for. But I, like, as someone who has like a bit of a musical background, but not anything like this at all, and it's just like much more personal, me playing the guitar, like I do think they're so good at rooting everything in fundamental character drama that transcends the particulars of the instrumentation, but the instrumentation gives color to what they're trying to express through their characters.
I mean, Thomas, you invoked the scene at the end of the movie, this is actually the climax of the movie, where Mizore asks Taki-sensei, like, hey, instead of doing the whole thing, can we go to movement 3? And I do. Taki-sensei is not in this movie much. I like that moment because you can see in his eyes, like, finally the kids are getting it. This is great. I love seeing them take the initiative. He's so happy for a second there that he's like, Mizore's going to do it. The bluebird's going to fly. And I like that little glint in his eye. But no, you get that scene, and this is the kind of scene we've been talking about in season 1 and season 2, where Kyoto Animation and all their collaborators have to tell the story through music. There aren't going to be any words other than what they've set up the scene with, but this is the moment where they have to pay off the theme of the movie, which is that the bluebird isn't Nozomi, it's Mizore. And Mizore is just a better, more committed musician than Nozomi is, and she is the one who might go to a music college. She's the one who was born to do this, and like conveying that purely through the music and then through the animation of the music, the framing of it all. I think this is even better than any comparable scenes in season 1 and 2 at telling that story, where you get to the end of that scene. I think I was on the edge of my seat. I don't know if there were tears in my eyes or not, but I was like extremely emotional because you just feel it, that you are watching like true greatness unfold. And you are seeing the gap between the two of them, where Nozomi is a very competent musician. She's probably good enough for this competition, but she's not a flautist who's going to do this as her career. And over here is Mizore, who is genuinely like preternaturally gifted at this and is able to fly. And you just do that through the grounded act of playing instruments. But of course, it's not completely grounded. It's not filmed, it's animated. They have to do every frame. They had to get the orchestra that they work, or the band that they work with, to get the performance just right to convey that. And again, there aren't really comparable moments in other pieces of media I can name that aren't literal music documentaries about talented musicians. The closest would be something like the Damien Chazelle movie Whiplash, which I think gets it on maybe a musical level, but as Thomas has pointed out to me many times, it does not look like Miles Teller is actually playing the drum in that movie, because he wasn't.
Whiplash, I don't want to talk about that too much, but just to throw this in here, for some reason, a lot of musicians hate shows about music because they only focus on how accurate it is. So Sound Euphonium has an advantage in that way. No musician teacher in the world is like, Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons in that movie. So drummers like bounce off that movie because they don't know what it's. Anyway, that's not important to this. But one thing you mentioned, Jonathan, that I just want to say, because I don't know if I'll probably forget it later. I feel bad for the flutist. I think it's the college freshman band or whatever at that one conservatory. Who had to do the part of Nozomi, because I think they rightly said, like, it has to be obvious that she's not playing as well as Mizore, so she kind of plays badly rather than not exceptionally. And that's just a small detail I wanted to mention. Like, I think Nozomi is actually probably a better flautist or flutist than we're hearing, but like they have to make the gap more obvious a little bit. And they do a good job with that. But like in the first scene where they finally get into the classroom and they practice the solo together a little bit, the flute is like really flat, and it's like, well, she's good enough to fix that.
I think in the final scene, there's at least like she's breaking down in tears at one point.
Yeah.
She's emotionally affected. Like I can buy that she's probably not at her best in like at the competition she would be better. But I see and I probably can't determine the nuances to the level you can. I certainly can't to the level you can, Thomas. But it probably speaks to it was probably the right call because Sean and I got the point, and we don't know how the flute is probably supposed to sound as well as you do.
Well, and my favorite moment that I assume they had to direct sort of specifically is after she's crying and she tries to start playing again. You hear so much air in the sound, and flute has like this unfortunate thing where you need as much air as a tuba basically to play it, but most of it is wasted because you're just blowing across this tone hole rather than directly into the instrument. So you get this thing where like she's crying so she can't hold her embouchure, her lip position correctly, and so you just wind up hearing more and more air and less of the tone of the instrument. And that to me is like a really, really powerful musical moment of just what it feels like and what it sounds like when this kind of thing happens.
Yeah, and I think that is communicated so powerfully, and I was hugely impressed by that. It's just like having to think about, that's got to be a really complicated thing if you're the person actually playing the flute, because you're not a flute actor. You're a flute player, right? And so like they're really asking the instrument performers to do a lot, especially in this movie, to try to like tell the story and do really particular things with their performance that feel like okay, now try to play the flute like you're holding back tears. You know, like if someone asked me to like try to play the guitar, but you're about to break down into tears, I'm like, I don't know what the fuck to do. What are you even talking about? But obviously with flutes, it works better there because you have your breath is the instrument, is like how you're playing the instrument, and breath is also affected directly by crying. But yeah, like all that stuff I think is just amazing. The way that it's scripted, the way that it's filmed, the way that it is performed and animated. It gets into the root heart of the drama between these two people. One other thing I want to like when we're thinking about the performances between these two players that I think is really interesting about this movie is that, Jonathan, you said that like Mizore is preternaturally gifted with this instrument, and she probably is like very gifted. But the other thing I like that this movie does really show you consistently is Mizore is practicing all the fucking time, and Nozomi is never fucking practicing in this movie.
Right.
Nozomi is here because she likes the experience of being in the band. She likes the band culture and community. She's a leader. She's charismatic, and she probably is supposed like good at the flute. But she also took a whole year off when she quit for her second year. She's not like really committed to practicing in the sectionals and stuff like that. And Mizore is always fucking practicing. So of course Nozomi is not going to be good enough. Like, of course she's out of sync. Of course she's not able to get the performance that she needs. And that's dragging Mizore down more and more and more as the movie goes on. And it's one thing I think the movie does a really good job at. And in some ways, I think better than the TV show, because the TV show has so much else going on, it can't always show it. But there is such a focus on, like, every other time you cut to Mizore, she's either about to begin practicing or she is just finishing practicing. Every single time you cut to Nozomi, she's chatting with her friends and they're having cookies in the classroom. It's like, if, you know, as I was not a music coach, but as a debate coach, where you would, like, send, okay, like, you guys go practice your piece here, you guys go do research in this room, because you have to split you up because you're all talking and shit. And if you're then go to the room and you're like, come on, guys, you're supposed to be going through your piece. Like, why are you just sitting here shooting the shit and eating your Cheez-Its or fucking whatever's going on, your spicy Takis, which is what the kids are into these days.
What the fuck is a spicy Taki?
You don't know Takis? They're intense.
No.
Jonathan's an old man. It's a whole thing, but like it's so true to me that like it reflects a reality of these different kinds of people and these young people and their different dedications to music and the art and all that kind of stuff. And Mizore's got that in spades, even if she doesn't realize it. I don't think she's as self-conscious about it. And Nozomi is like, she's, nothing wrong with Nozomi as a person, but she's kind of flaky. She's a little bit of a slacker. She's like really nice and a good leader of people, but she's not a great musician because she's not really putting in the time to do it.
Nozomi is one of the girls from K-On! I mean, like,
Yes.
literally, she is, because all the girls in K-On! Are clearly talented, but they are also idiots who never practice their instruments. They could probably go the distance. This is my whole theory of, like, what's the name of the underclassman in K-On! Who... Azusa. I think Azusa fucking, like, becomes a major, like, rock star because she's the only one who wanted to practice, while the other girls, like, I don't know, they go to college and they get regular jobs or something. But, like, that is totally... Nozomi is one of those characters who I feel like Yamada Naoko has some kind of clear understanding and empathy with.
Yes. Well, in multiple interviews, I said she repeatedly said that she identifies personally with Nozomi, and that was like the character she was kind of most focused on in a weird way, which I think there's definitely a K-On! Connection there for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, Thomas, I'm so glad you're here because you're able to use all the language correctly. This podcast is already so better because Sean and I don't know what the fuck we're talking about with all this stuff. So this is great. We have you to say all the technical things.
Well, and I don't want to be an elitist saying, you have to say it the right way or I won't be your friend, but that is true.
Okay.
You wrote an entire essay accusing Jonathan as being a cannibal last time, so it is very...
I didn't say he was a cannibal. I said his madness was akin to that of a cannibal. Totally different.
He has reminded me several times since that episode came out. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Thomas, you were going to say something. What were you going to say?
Well, you just... I wanted to mention this. This is a little unrelated, but Sean, you were talking about sectionals and how they're not, the flutes aren't really practicing their sectionals necessarily. Jonathan mentioned to me at one point before I had heard your podcast on season 1 that you had some problems with Taki Sensei as a teacher. And I was like, yeah, because he should be in those sectionals coaching them. He shouldn't be sitting in the office. He should be going room to room. That wasn't your problem, but I thought that was funny because that was my problem.
Yes, I mean, yeah, because I also get that like you don't really see him teaching much. It is one of the things that, like, it's still a question I have of, like, I still don't actually understand his full role in the school. Is he a full-time teacher? Is he just a coach who comes in? But, like, I also think, like, the series being made from someone who was a student and not someone who was a teacher, I think it means that they want to be able to have the students be able to have their drama, and that would feel very different if Taki Sensei was always kind of hovering around the edges. So I understand from narratively why they don't do it. But yes, he doesn't go in and he doesn't usually actually give them advice. He's there to conduct, say, what is this? And then give them occasional, like, little pearls of wisdom every once in a while.
Yeah, he does a lot of lecturing, like, to the point where it feels kind of mean. Like, there's the scene in this one where he's talking to both Nozomi and Mizore, first to Nozomi about, like, you're not responding to the flute, you're getting too emotional. And then he, like, lectures Mizore, like, you're not responding to I said flute, I meant oboe. You're not responding to the flute because she's, slowing down a little bit and you're being a little too non-rubato, we might say.
What the fuck is... Yeah, you're going to have to. I don't know what that means.
So rubato is... It's a direction that might be written in music or a playing style. Usually it's for soloists when you don't play specifically in time. So, like, the background people might be playing, perfectly in time, but you're not playing every single quarter note exactly on the beat. You're adding some expressiveness to the timing to get that phrasing across. So playing non-rubato would be like playing very robotic on the beat.
Yeah, and you're saying that, like, what Mizore and Nozomi are trying to do, and this is what Taki Sensei is saying in that speech, is, like, you are listening, you're responding to each other as musicians. You're not just going raw off of, here's, like, this coordinate and this eighth note, whatever. It's like you're trying to respond and have the music flow between you, and he uses the metaphor of, like, water, rather than just you are playing your part. And that's where, like, I think sometimes the translation of the dialogue, to me, like, feels a little bit off, because I think sometimes they're maybe afraid to use music terms in the translation, which would make sense, but they're just use the term in sync over and over and over again. I'm like, that's not exactly what they're saying. They're not saying, like, in sync. It's saying, like, there's more of a call and response and a push and pull is how he refers to it in Japanese. And I always just kind of felt like the subtitle saying, oh, you're not in sync enough, always felt a little bit weird.
Yeah, call and response and push and pull would also be more natural to use in a music classroom. So you're vindicated, Sean.
Thank you.
I actually really like that scene with Taki. Like, I agree the subtitles are probably a little too robotic there. Ironic given what he's saying. I actually really like that scene of talking about, like, this is more than the notes on the paper. This is, I actually saw a whole Twitter post about this the other day, and I was trying to find it because it was someone had taken a quote out of a book on musicology, and it was a music professor talking about like how music notation is different than a written language because it is missing so many pieces. Like it tells you the basics, but it is essentially a psychological thing that it is doing because it's giving you the basics of something much bigger that you're building off of it. And I thought that was really interesting because that's also kind of what Taki Sensei is saying there.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of what goes into the actual performance that the note on the page is not actually expressing, that there's so many other things that you're doing as a musician. While we're talking about Taki Sensei, one other thing, I just found this very funny because, the interesting thing about this movie is that you have such a different aesthetic style here, but you're still sometimes reflecting on things you saw in Sound Euphonium. And so when you have something that was both in the TV show and in the movie, it highlights an interesting consistency. And one little thing that Taki Sensei does that Yamada Naoko puts a specific shot in highlighting that I love is he always does this stuff where he makes little geometric shapes with his hands when he's talking. And that's a detail of maybe there was a former teacher or someone at KyoAni who has put this little detail in because it's so true to me as a teacher that since you are up in front of people talking and having to present all the time, you are 100% of your working life is you wondering what the fuck do I do with my hands? When you're presenting on stage and you're I don't know what to do with my hands. And every teacher has a different thing. I'm always playing with the board markers and I'll throw them up and catch them and stuff. Other teachers have other little things they'll do, bouncing their hands off of each other and stuff. He makes little geometric shapes. He does it all the time in the TV show, and I really love that they concluded it here. And it's one nice little detail that makes it feel like you are seeing still Sound Euphonium. It's still the show. It's the same world. It's the same characters. You're just seeing it through the eyes of a very different person. And Mizore sees the world in this much more subdued, realistic way, whereas Kumiko's life is so fucking crazy and dramatic that she sees the world as an anime, whereas Mizore sees it as this sort of what feels like a more grounded reality. But all those little details, and Taki Sensei has a couple of those little things that he does that are weird little physical tics from the show that are preserved here, even with the different aesthetic that I thought was really cool.
Can we talk about the aesthetic for a minute? Because I think it is fucking incredible. And this is something that you so rarely see in a show like Sound Euphonium, but this is one of my favorite things about maybe a long-running shonen anime is when you just get radically different art styles within the same piece of work. Mm-hmm. This is something I love about, Dragon Ball over the years, you get this. One Piece, you really get this. Because every couple of years, the One Piece anime just overhauls its aesthetic completely. And this is something I think is a cool thing Toei has let One Piece do, is that they've let, Mamoru Hosoda came in for movie 6 and made Luffy look like a Mamoru Hosoda character. And then the anime was that movie looked really good. Let's just kind of use those designs for a while. And then you get to the Wano arc and it looks completely different. And then the current arc, the Egghead Island, they've also really kind of overhauled things. And it's something I like where the manga is one thing, but there's so many ways you can interpret it. I think we forget when there's an anime and it's one core, one season or whatever, or it's a long-running anime that just sticks with one aesthetic. That aesthetic is always an interpretation of the manga source material or the original drawings or the character designs or whatever, and there's always other interpretations you can do. But it's very rare in a show like Sound Euphonium that you will get a radically different interpretation in the main body of the series by the same studio. Maybe you'll get it if the studio changes, like Attack on Titan did between seasons 3 and 4, so the last season looks very different. But with this kind of thing, again, it's just, especially from the same studio, you're not going to see this much. And I think it's so cool to have Nishio Futoshi come in, and I think it's not just that he comes in and changes up things. Obviously, that redounds to every single person working on the movie has to consider things very differently, and it's got a different kind of color design, and it's got a different, character design style. You've been using the words, Sean, more grounded and realistic, and I understand that particularly on a color level. The hair looks more like real human hair. Taki Sensei now looks like someone with nice hair that is attractive. He doesn't have an inhuman poof that is perfect anime god, right?
Kumiko doesn't have her weird 2 puffs that come out of the bottom that you're what do you do every time you get up in the morning, Kumiko? You just slather your hair in gel and just really rip those things out there to get that. But yes, yeah.
You have that, but there's other things that are not as that are their own kind of gesticulations of the animation. So like everyone is taller in this movie. Everyone is a little tall. That's a very, again, my like touchstone for that is this is very common in Mamoru Hosoda's movies. His characters are lanky and tall and have like proportions that are a little off. You get that here. Like everyone's neck is weirdly long in this movie. And you particularly notice it on the characters who were in Sound Euphonium in a more major way. Like Reina has a much longer neck now, and you see that in her couple of scenes. And so you have that, you know, the characters are a little lankier, they're a little taller. That isn't necessarily realistic. It's just another way of expressing things. And I think it works for this story so well. And if you have a familiarity with the show, I think it also helps instill the fact that, and this is what you were saying earlier, Sean, we are seeing this through Mizore's eyes, and like having a different art style. And this is an animation thing. Can't really do this in live action to this extent. You know, just telling you through the aesthetics subliminally, right from the moment the movie starts, this is not Kumiko's story. This is not how the world looks to Kumiko. This is how the world looks to Mizore. It's a way of doing that, you know, right off the bat and getting you into that subjectivity, in addition to being a gorgeous movie where, you know, I don't think one version of Sound Euphonium is like better animated or looking than the other. I will say Liz and the Bluebird is a little more to like my personal tastes of animation. There's a little more of the visible like line work because the pencil lines on characters are so thin and things like that. So this is like totally my shit and I really love it. But I love even more that we have both. And I think that's so fucking cool.
Yeah, and like you also just have the like much more intense kind of post-processing photographic effects that we're now very accustomed to with Yamada Naoko's movies. That like it's fun to see the progression because it felt like you saw a lot of it in very particular scenes in K.O. the movie where you had your like montages where she went really like intense with it, and then it's much more omnipresent in Tamako Love Story. It's really omnipresent in A Sign of the Voice, and it's really omnipresent here. And it's particularly notable in this film because you have it contrasted with this more classical animation style with the storybook sequences, that then when you look at that, like the images from the sort of like quote unquote real world in the movie in the storybook sequences, you see the way in which the image has been processed to put like depth of field and different lens style effects on there to make it feel like it's something shot through an actual camera in a way that the TV show also does, because basically almost every KyoAni production does. But it's far more pronounced here. And there are some shots that have like, with the depth of field, that have like super, super intense shifts in the depth of field. Like near the end, there's the shot where Nozomi and Mizore are in the science room with each other and they're having their like big kind of heart to heart before they hug it out. And there's one shot where it's like a petri dish or something, like right in front of the camera, and that's like that's at like a table on the opposite end of the room, and Mizore and Nozomi are on the far opposite end. And because of how intense the depth of field is, because you're focused on something so small right up to the camera, Mizore and Nozomi are just complete blurs. Like you can barely tell that it's them in the background until the focus pushes out to them. And there's a couple of other shots like that science room, where there's one somewhere around the midpoint of the movie where Niyama Sensei is there, and you have all the different lines of the tables that you have in the science classes, that because of the way that, you know, the depth of field is going to work, it's going to push through and kind of roll over each of those tables, because there's such a sense of depth to the image, because you have all these different 3D objects jutted up through the ground. And the way that Yamada Naoko plays with all those different kind of photographic effects is another thing that grounds it in something that feels like a reality. It feels like you could step into the world being expressed here. This is part of the thing what I see in like when Yamada Naoko uses the word kuki or atmosphere to express her and like style. I think this is part of it, is the sense of the space in the world in which these characters inhabit is one that you could inhabit also, even though it obviously is highly stylized. It's clearly animation. They're not trying to make it you like fool you into thinking it's live action. And yet all those different kinds of techniques do so much to make you feel like it is this very grounded reality. There's this much plainer world that Mizore lives in compared to the storybook of Liz and the Blue Bird, or compared to the much more heightened adolescent drama that is the life of Oh My Kumiko.
Absolutely, and again, you also just have to give it to a group of people that we don't talk about enough, and I think are generally not talked about in anime, which is just the photography department or the composition department, whatever the titles change in the digital era, but the job is still the same. And we've always said this: KyoAni's is uniquely good because, again, no one sits down and draws it out of focus. That's not how you do this. It's you take the drawings and then you layer them. Now you would do it in the computer, and you would have to figure out optically, how to process this so that it looks correct in the final composition. And that doesn't happen out of nowhere. That takes a lot of talent and skill, and it's something, I think there's a reason why Yamada Naoko develops the style she develops, and it's because she came of artistic age at Kyoto Animation, where they had been doing stuff like this since before she got there. And on the show she worked on, like Haruhi, were developing these ideas, and she kind of takes that baton and, really runs with it in her work. But I think, if she had started her career somewhere else, she probably wouldn't have had this exact kind of focus, because it clearly does come out of the atmosphere that KyoAni has in their work, of which she is kind of now the apogee of, I think, as an artist.
Yeah, absolutely. The other aspect aesthetically we have to talk about then is there is the other aesthetic of the film, or the other primary aesthetic, which is the parallel storyline in the storybook of Liz and the Blue Bird, which this is one of my favorite things in the movie, is how good they are at capturing the essence of that Miyazaki-esque Heidi Girl of the Alps World Masterpiece Theater thing, while also not literally just being that, right? It's capturing the same energy, and it has a lot of the similar markers from that, particularly like the Blue Bird girl is just a Miyazaki girl, which I adore. Like her hair flares up in that very Miyazaki-esque way, and so there's a lot of specific markers that they borrow, while also still obviously having a lot of their own sort of original invention to how to develop the aesthetic. But it makes so much sense because that is what in universe Liz and the Blue Bird is. When you see the book that Nozomi shows Mizore, that's Liz and the Blue Bird, Jonathan, you said earlier, you're like, I don't understand why Ushio Kensuke had the title in the soundtrack be in German. It's because it's supposed to be a German book.
Okay,
the book
right.
Says Liz und ein Barvogel, which is, I'm very good at German. That's very much how it's supposed to be pronounced. Which is written by, let me zoom in a little bit more on this image, because you have his name here. It's the Saksha. I really want to see how they would try to write this with English characters, because it's very, I'm not entirely sure. It's like Berislav Hitchell is supposed to be the author, and the artist is Berislav Rovani. So I like that apparently the writer and the artist on it both happen to be named Berislav, which I don't know what the names that's supposed to be.
Do you think that's supposed to be their last names, and because it's Japanese people making this, they were like last name first?
It can't be, because they're not idiots. They have the dot there in the middle that indicates it's supposed to be a Western name order. And there's a part. I'm trying to scroll through my screenshot gallery, which is ridiculously fucking long, and find the part where she's getting the books from the library. Here it is. Because you also have a section where you have a nice shot from Mizore's point of view, where she's going and getting the books from the library, where you have all these fake book titles, and you see several other books written by Berislav Hitchell. So it's not just Liz and the Blue Bird, it's also Take the Oar, the King of Sindora, Anya Harinen's 15 Secrets, The Sun Boy and the Moon Girl, and those are all the other books written by this same author. And then you do, on the right-hand side, you have some Russian author named Viktor Baralev, and he's written such great books as Skefe Ninhin, which I don't know what name that's supposed to be, but it's supposed to be a name, Nikolai II, and then Eisenstein and Griffith. So if you want to have
that's a film book. That's Sergei Eisenstein and D.W. Griffith. So that is, and that actually might exist, because there are books about Eisenstein would have written about Griffith. Yeah. I do, Sean, I think Yamada Naoko is obligated to make movies out of all of those books. I want to see The Sun Boy and the Moon Girl by Yamada Naoko. I think that would be delightful. And on what you were saying about the Ghibli connection, because it is particularly the Bluebird Girl is just a dead ringer for every Miyazaki heroine ever. But also, I think you're right that it is they are evoking the style without aping it. And I think that's important because there are plenty of anime works out there that have tried to ape the Studio Ghibli style, and it never works. I'm sorry. It's like, why would you even try? Like, you're not gonna do it better, so maybe go in a slightly different direction. One of Makoto Shinkai made the biggest mistake in his career is his movie Children Who Chase Lost Voices, which is him just trying to make a Miyazaki movie, and it's terrible, in part because, like, if you're not those people, I just don't think you can do it the same way. But, like, this shows me this is how you do it, which is that you take the general kind of idea, but you kind of push it in your own direction. Like, the way they use watercolors, the way the backgrounds are a little more unfinished. And honestly, that pushes more towards Takahata than Miyazaki anyway. But, like, it evokes those things without feeling like it is aping them. And it makes for, like, such a gorgeous thing that you kind of want the whole fucking movie that is the fairy tale book because it looks so cool.
Yeah, and it's just like the whole style of how characters move is completely different. There's that really light, fluttery nature to the characters. They have the big dress gowns that billow up whenever they run around, and like really emphasizes the movement. Like when you have the Bluebird girl has some like tomato soup or something for the first time in her life, and she's like, "Oh, it's delicious," and she jumps and dances around the room. And her dress flows after her. Like, all those little things, they are these nice little touches that evoke the essence of that kind of beautiful pastoral anime of the past, while also being very much its own thing. And then there's all these other little touches in the animation I love. I love the insanely gigantic bread at the Bäckerl, which I assume is German for bakery or something. And it's just, you have these giant loaves of bread that are like half as big as the fucking characters. Like, they're thicker than their arms. You have that giant donut ring thing in the window that literally you could stick your fucking head through. And I just love the idea of this world where bread is just like humongous. And like you can buy one loaf of bread and live off of it for a goddamn week. But it just adds to that sense of this weird fairy book reality. You've got all the fucking animals that Liz is with. It's like the squirrels hang out on her head. One of my favorite parts of the movie is at the very beginning, you have the little raccoon walks up and puts its little paw on her shoulder like it's fucking Buddy the dog from Nichijou. Whenever something bad would happen to her, the little dog would come up and put its paw on her shoulder to reassure her. Here's a little raccoon buddy being like, "Hey, like, how are you doing? How are you having a good time?" And then you've got the little blue bird as soon as I saw the shot with the blue bird, I cackled because it's got the little spots on its cheeks like Dara in Tamako Market. And I'm like, yes, this is Yamada Naoko has not forgotten her greatest character of all time. But because like, this is a world where it feels like Dara could just walk into this place. And he's like, it's so cartoonish. It's so romantic. It's so otherworldly and pure and beautiful. That it feels like, she could burst into song and be singing with the little birds like she's Snow White or something. I think the way that they capture that energy is so incredible in a movie where that is, you've got quite a few of those scenes, but it's, maybe about 10 minutes total of the runtime of a 90-minute film. The amount of energy and time that they would have to take to develop this whole other art style and all the artistic techniques they need to do to represent this art style in this other movie that has another very demanding art style to perfect. It's pretty phenomenal what they do here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thomas, anything you wanted to add about the animation and look of the movie?
Yeah, the bread, while it is huge, it doesn't look as insanely delicious as like Ghibli bread does.
It's true.
Just worth noting. And I assume you wanted to get to this too, and maybe this is, to me, this is sort of part of the aesthetic is just the music. But maybe you want to talk about that later. I don't know.
Well, were you going to say like the music in the fairy tale sequences? Because that is such also like an effective evocation of kind of the Ghibli music style. And that's the other composer in those scenes.
Well, yeah. And I think in both, it really differentiates itself from the music of the show Sound Euphonium and the other movie and just the style it's going for. It's a lot more cartoony. It does not exactly, but it gets sort of into the territory of Mickey Mousing, which is when the music is like really, really closely synced with the action to the point where like, if Donald Duck's neck stretches out, you might have a trombone glistening, something like that.
Like a good example is when the rainstorm comes in.
Yeah.
Like that's the exact thought I had of like where the music almost summons the rain, and it's so in sync with what's happening there that it's so scored to the action.
Yeah, especially in the fairy tale, it's not necessarily that every movement one to one has something musically with the visual, but like the mood is created by the picture in association with the music, I think. So you have like you've got the Highwind Woods for the morning, then the Euphonium is when she's going to bed. When the storm comes in, it's the bass clarinet and this low flute. When it's the morning again, now you've got the reeds and horns, sort of this triumphant afterstorm thing. It's very, like, it's not cartoonish necessarily, but it's very obvious.
And that is also just is, again, in conversation with a different kind of animation style that is, because the pastoral nature of animation that the World Masterpiece Theater thing is responding to is rooted in like early American animation, like, your Silly Symphonies and things like that. Flowers and Trees is the first color cartoon by Disney and stuff like that. So it has that kind of westernized aesthetic in multiple ways, although it is, especially in this movie, it is clearly interpolated through the sort of way animation has evolved in Japan, particularly the use of watercolor in those backgrounds, which are just stunningly beautiful. Like, it is some of the most amazing background work we've seen from KyoAni, who have very good background work. But yeah, those sections are insane to look at and to watch, and I love them. If it's not a complaint to the movie that it doesn't have more, because I think the balance is perfect, but boy, I want them to. I would love to see KyoAni do a 12-episode anime that is just a World Masterpiece Theater homage, because no one else is equipped to do it as well as them.
And then there is one other like sort of visual aesthetic element, like part of the movie that you get here and there, where you have, we've been talking about the word subjective here, but you have this truly like not just subjective, but purely internal representation of, it's mostly Mizore sequences that do this, although you have a couple of Nozomi ones, like you have the big Nozomi one near the end where she remembers meeting Mizore for the first time, but you have these sequences that are very abstractly represented that exist in this white space, and then also you have there this very particular artistic technique that is used that I had to look up that's called decalcomania, which is the sequences with the bird, the blue bird that flies. And you get it like sort of suggested at various points in the film. Like early on, you have a sequence like this, and then it happens I think one other time, and then it happens again in a big way during the huge performance at the end, where what this artistic technique, decalcomania, is where you basically draw one half of a symmetrical image on the center point of a page. You then color it in with paint, and then you fold the page and press it and blot it against the other side to then create a symmetrical image. And so they did this to make these interesting representations of the blue bird flying that Mizore kind of sees in her mind's eye. In my screenshot gallery, I took some specific screens because it's one where, like, if you go through frame by frame, you can just see every individual frame, which is a completely unique one of these ink blot kind of artistic pieces. And it's so gorgeous, and it's such a different style that because of like how different it is in terms of the sequencing of images there, and how kind of each one is a little bit imperfect, right? Because it is just how the paint blotted on the other side, they are mostly symmetrical, but like there's little bits of imperfection here and there. Some of them look clearly like a bird, other ones look less like it. It almost has a Rorschach ink blot effect to it in some ways. But if you watch it playing at the animation speed, you can register it as an animation, even though it does have a little bit more of this start-stop, almost stop-motion-y kind of effect to it, because of how clear the difference is between the two frames. There's so much difference in the spacing between the images and the frames that you're like consciously aware of the fact that you're seeing a series of images rather than what feels like a flowing video. And that it's such a cool look. I've never seen anything like it. And I thought that is such an amazing way to represent this idea in Mizore's, her consciousness, and visualizing this bird that is flying away that represents her moving on and moving to sort of like another place with herself as a musician and as a person. And that's just like one of those touches that Yamada Naoko is so good at including all these different artistic elements in her movies. It feels like like evolution of a thing that we saw in going back to Tomoko Love Story, where you have the scene where Tomoko runs home after the confession and the world melts away and she's running through this abstract watercolor world of just like blots of color all over the place. And this feels like it's an evolution of some of those things where Yamada Naoko goes to this interesting abstract artistic place to represent these really powerful internal feelings or thoughts that characters have.
There's also a moment in right after the sort of final scene of the movie before sort of the little epilogue moment with the two of them, where we get our, happy ice cream scene, that whole thing.
Yes.
But it is the final montage is the two of them in one sense going their separate ways. And you have Mizore practicing her oboe and kind of redoubling that effort. You have Nozomi going to the library to practice for her college entrance exams because she's going to be going to a non-musical college. But then at the end of that sequence, you get one of those, ink, watercolor on. What was the practice called, Sean?
Decalcomania.
You get a decalcomania, but it is of a blue blot and a red blot, and they begin separate, and then they come together and bleed together, and you can literally see like the water between them running and create a new color. And I think that is such a great way to express what is going on in that scene, which is that while they are pursuing separate interests, they are actually coming together in a way that they have not done before because they have a greater sense of themselves in their relationship. As the final scene of the movie tells us, the movie starts with, because Yamada Naoko can't do a big play with the title of this movie because it is just unambiguously the title of the movie is Liz and the Bluebird. So we don't have the three separate titles like a silent voice had. So we have the title once, but at the beginning we have the word disjoint written by hand, and then at the end we get the dis scribbled out because they are jointed together. But I think the decalcomania of that with the blue and the red that blur after the sequence of them kind of going separately, that is a beautiful piece of filmmaking. That whole sequence, in fact, I just adore.
Yeah.
Well, and
Go ahead, Thomas.
I just wanted to say that Inkblot, I think thematically is really cool too. It the first time it pops up is when they're starting the storybook flashback or the storybook sequence, but they also flash back to them meeting for the first time. And it's right after Mizore looks at Nozomi's eyes, which are blue, and it's the blue blot. And then at the end, it comes back to that scene, but it's Nozomi looking at Mizore and her red eyes, and they had the red blot to it.
Were their eyes that different colored in the TV show? I don't remember that.
I don't remember, but they also changed color, like Nozomi's sort of shift from blue to teal and back. So I think it's just sort of a free-flowing thing of...
It's very it's like in this movie it becomes like, as you say, it's a real motif because one having red, one having blue, because so much of the movie also is close-ups on their eyes, and so it wants you to be able to recognize them from that alone. This movie does have the best quivering eye animation I think I've ever seen. There's some shots of Mizore's like eye teary quivering that like, Jesus, that looks hard to animate. I don't know how they do that, but wow, it looks good.
Like the desperation with which she looks at Nozomi is like so just vivid on her eyes, and I don't even know how to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of that thing of what that Torikiru term that I had a hard time trying to translate, of this idea of like you're going in so close to the subject that they are like consume the entire frame, like you're trying to photograph every little detail of it. And I think that's so much of what she's trying to express. Because that is, as someone who went through with a fine-tooth comb and took screenshots of this movie, that's like 90% of the movie is close-ups on their faces, and then a reverse shot showing what they are looking at. Like that's most of the film. Because it's so much about representing the eternal thoughts and feelings of these two people without them being verbally expressed, because they are at this place where they can't really feel like they can't really communicate those feelings, or when they try to communicate those feelings, they don't come across or are rebuffed. And so it's all about the audience just living in the heads, particularly of Mizore, but also Nozomi, and looking at them looking, and then seeing what they're looking at, and then drawing your interpretations of what that means in terms of the inside of what they're thinking.
And I wanted to talk about this too, like the nature of the gazes that we get in this movie, I think are so interesting. And when you compare them to what we get with like Kumiko and Reina in season 1 of the TV show, which I think, Sean, you and I both argued is a pretty explicitly, like, to some degree, erotic gaze, right? Like there is a real heat to that. And obviously, most obviously in episode 8, the one where they go up the mountain and they're talking about, and you have Kumiko looking lovingly at Reina's feet, and you have them using the word erotic, and you have Reina come over and trace her finger across Kumiko's lips like very lovingly, and the finger just comes off the lip, and this is perfect little piece of animation, and then Reina gets the full Marilyn Monroe of her dress going up. So that is like pretty explicit. This is an interesting one where at the beginning of the movie I was kind of wondering, would this go in that kind of direction? Because Yamada Naoko has done that with other characters in her movies, right? And in her works. And she is interested in LGBT characters sometimes. But like here, I think it so clearly communicates a gaze that is intense and is powerful, but is outside the boundaries of an easy like sexual dynamic. This is not about a sort of if you read it this way, I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but the way I was reading it, at least, or the way it came across to me, is that this is a different kind of longing that we don't have an easy language for, that is hard to put into words. It's in those quotes you gave us earlier, Sean, from Yamada Naoko and from the author of the books, Takada Sensei, of like, what is interesting about these characters' relationship, and we talked about it a little bit in season 2 as well, in that it is a love, it is an obsession, but it doesn't fit into kind of the buckets you have even for other characters in Sound Euphonium. And I think this movie is so good at doing that to such a degree that, like, I don't feel the sense of, that I think is there in the show sometimes, that the show can get into a little bit of a queer baiting space with how hard it goes on that, but how it can't actually follow through. I don't think there's any of that disconnect here. I think it is able to fully pay off on the kinds of gazing it is having the characters engage in.
Yeah, and I think also I think what I kind of read in it is also that, like, what Mizore sees in Nozomi is different than what Nozomi sees in Mizore. And that's like Kumiko and Reina, I think both, there's a mutual thing there. Here, I think I get the read from Mizore that she does have, like, her feelings move into this more romantic and potentially sexual dynamic, where I don't really read that from Nozomi. I think they both care about each other a lot, but there is a disconnect between, like, exactly how that's expressed. Like, you see the way in which Mizore, like, physically responds so intensely to Nozomi's presence, and it's really highlighted in the first scene of the film with them, after you have the title kind of credit sequence happen. They go and sit down in the music room. You have the part where Nozomi takes the Listen to Blue Bird book, moves her seat next to Mizore, and the way that Mizore reacts to that physical presence and that closeness, and she kind of like leans in a little bit, and there's a little bit of focus on her hair potentially like falling off of her shoulder, and this is the first time we get that the Calcomania effect with the bird coming in. And as the hair falls off and she's like about to touch Nozomi's shoulder, Nozomi gets up and moves her seat back over, completely oblivious that like, or seemingly oblivious that interaction has happened. And I think that's like one of the things in this film is that there are characters that I think have different kinds of feelings, or their feelings are at a different register for each other or come from a different place. However much you want to read that into maybe Mizore is queer and Nozomi is straight, or what. Like, I think it's giving you lots of space to read that. Also, obviously involved in this is for me, this clear sense that Mizore is a neurodivergent person, right? She feels and sees and experiences the world in a way that's very different than the average student. And I think that colors all these interactions as well. She has this like intense longing for Nozomi because she has sort of defined Nozomi in the specific way to herself. And part of her journey in this movie is opening that up and letting other people like Ririka in, and sort of redefining the way she sees the world and sees people. But all of it is communicated in this wordless way through their glances, through their reactions, through their breathing, which you can hear, right? Like, all those things are such an intense, again, voyeuristic, sensory feeling of you're like peeking in on this room, or you're like right in between them, looking up and like staring at them, seemingly like without them knowing that you're there, and getting into their personal space, feeling what they're feeling and seeing what they're seeing. And that intimacy that's expressed is so good at allowing you to explore the feelings of the two characters that are a little bit misaligned and a little bit vague and enigmatic, and they themselves are having a hard time defining what that exact relationship they want to have with each other is.
Like, you see really obviously the way that Mizore looks at Nozomi. Like, when she goes to return the book on that first day, she's sort of staring at the nape of her neck, which is sort of a sensual thing. But I don't think it reads as sensual to me. It's more just like she notices every little thing about Nozomi. And when Nozomi looks back, she's just looking at Mizore. That's not bad. It's just like that's the way she looks at her is, this is just my friend Mizore now. This is my friend, with the amazing neck and the bright smile and the reflective personality. And she draws all these people to her. And I think that actually sort of changes as the movie goes on. Well, more towards the end, at least, where she starts looking at different details of Nozomi when her inspiration for sort of continuing with the oboe changes from I want to play the oboe because then this is some way for me to connect with Nozomi to I want to play the oboe because I actually love the oboe. So she starts looking sort of at music a little more detailed and at Nozomi a little more generally.
Yeah, you get less of the subjective staring at, let me look at your feet, let me look at the nape of your neck, let me look at the pink watch you have on your wrist. Yeah, like all those like really intense shots of her gaze fixated, and then you see these little close-ups of different parts of Nozomi. Yeah, that starts to move away, and instead it's her looking at her from a distance, and then reshifting her attention to her music or her oboe or whatever else she's doing.
If we wanted to go full film studies with this, there is a fetishization of Nozomi in the early parts of this movie in breaking up her body into pieces through the frame, through where she is looking. This is a whole thing in Freudian, psychoanalysis, and this is something in film as well, because film is inherently fetishistic and voyeuristic, and then film, because of how you frame things, unless you're framing a full body, you are sometimes inherently creating fetish objects out of parts of, the body. And I do think some of this, this is not just me being a snooty film person. I think some of this is conscious in the movie.
Yes.
But I would say on the other level, though, on a more grounded reality, we have talked about Mizore being neurodivergent, maybe being somewhere on the autism spectrum. I think it's smart that the movie doesn't ever name that, because you get into trouble, I think, in a bunch of different ways when you try to be too specific. But one thing obviously that happens with certain autistic people is a common. I'm not a psychologist, but one of the common symptoms is the inability to look someone in the eyes, or having trouble looking at someone directly. And that's a huge thing you see throughout this movie. I think it's part of what makes her read that way. And it is the way that she, and I think the whole movie's style reflects this, catches, different parts of a person when she can't necessarily look them right in the eyes. And that's something she gets with Nozomi a lot, because Nozomi is someone she's more comfortable with, but even then has a certain apprehension around. And so that's built into the entire style of the movie as well.
One other element of that is also they've given her a new verbal tick or a physical tick that I didn't never notice in the show, where she grabs and runs her hand through her hair, which I love because it sort of highlights, and I feel like almost like kind of gives an explanation for this very weird detail of Mizore's character design that looks so different than all the other characters, which we talked about a little bit in season 2, where her hair kind of conforms and shapes around her neckline. So it kind of comes in and then goes back out around her shoulders, which it just looks unusual. It's not the way that your hair normally falls. And it's less accentuated in the new art style, but it's still there a little bit. But it feels like it's contextualized as she's always running her hand through her hair and kind of pressing it up against herself. And that's helped shape it along the kind of curves of her neck and her shoulders. Which again,
and she also has the single strands on either side that are often sticking out. That is a result of that too. That those pieces have kind of stayed in place while she's moved everything else up around the nape of her neck.
Yeah, and it kind of changes a little bit of how you read the character, where she's a little bit less sort of calm and organized and all this one full package, and she feels a little bit more frayed and nervous at most times. And I think because you're getting such more kind of close-up detail of her, it really emphasizes that aspect of that she's so often so intensely nervous. Like when she's talking to people, there's a lot of focus on her hands being very clenched, which they often are. Like when she's talking to Niyama sensei, her hands, there's a close-up of her hands just being very tightly clenched. And she just comes across as so high-strung, so inside herself, so nervous. And then you get some of that revealed with when Didika invites her out one time. She just says, "Oh, you don't want me there because I wouldn't be any fun." And she sort of has closed herself off in that way and has a hard time seeing that these new freshmen or first-year students, they legitimately want to spend time with Mizore. Spending time with Mizore is very valuable to them. She has a hard time seeing that in them because of how she's very clearly define her world in specific ways. And getting that definition to slip a little bit is very difficult for her.
Can we talk about the new students for a little bit? Because I
Yes.
love these characters so much. I'm hoping we get more in the next movie because they are adorable. Particularly, obviously, Rilika is the main one here. But man, it's so funny. I love how those characters play into things. It freshens up the atmosphere in so many cool ways. They're awesome.
Well, you've got like two different shots that I love of one early on when Ririka comes over, this first time you meet her, and she's trying to invite her to like, oh, we've made the double reed gang or whatever, basically. And it's like,
Yes.
You're the other oboist, so you should got to be in it too. And she's trying to invite her. And then when Mizore just kind of sort of, throws her off and gives her the cold shoulder, you get this great shot of Ririka like with her head down, and then in the background are the other two double readers who just like have their head like they're face palming. Yes. And then you have a mirrored shot then later, once Mizore started to open up, there's a sequence where Nozomi is talking about Mizore, and you get a kind of sequence of shots showing at the same time what Mizore is doing, and she's accepting the invitation from these double reed girls, and they're like really happy, and they're going and practicing together. And so, yeah, you do have... Ririka obviously is like the one that gets the full like kind of characterization and gets all the voice dialogue, but you have this whole sense of there's a little gang of them together that have all gotten together that really want to spend time with their senpai and get mentorship from this incredibly talented musician in the group, which Mizore is. And Mizore just has not realized that that's something that's like desired from her, right? It's not until she has that one little reaction with Ririka over the reeds, which we kind of talked about when Ririka then opens up afterwards, that's when she failed the audition, that now Mizore realizes, okay, I'm a senpai. I'm this person who these younger students look up to, that I can give them advice, and we can have fun, and we can chat, and we can be friends. And seeing that slow evolution with those characters is very fun.
Absolutely. Thomas, you can correct us if I'm wrong here, but I also like seeing, there's a little bit of a dynamic going on in the background that I think is probably a preview for what's going to happen in the movie and beyond of you've got this new, class of underclassmen coming in who are very enthusiastic because they're not coming into this like ruined marching band or, concert band that was kind of in tatters, but like all these people would kind of be rock stars to them because they went to nationals last year and all this stuff. And I like seeing it's a fully different dynamic than we saw with the first years in the first and second season of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do get a lot more of that in the other movie just because it focuses more on the bass section. So you get the two Suzukis who aren't sisters, but they have fun things going on. Just one thing about Ririka that is sort of my favorite, maybe my favorite just like little thing in the movie is she has a theme. Every
Yes.
time she's on screen, there's this little oboe riff that goes bop, 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 bop. And it's just great. It's like really whimsical, and it's like it's just great to have like an actual double reed, like oboe and bassoon feature in a motion picture that lets them be whimsical rather than like sentimental. I just love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great character. One fun thing about the character, there's a little bit of a pun in Japanese that I didn't realize until I saw the kanji, where Ririka's surname is Kenzaki, and Mizore's is Yoroizuka. And if you translate those names literally from their kanji, basically Mizore's surname means armor hill, and Ririka's surname means sword hill. So they are paired together, even metaphorically in their names. And Ririka's voiced by a voice actress, Sugiura Shiori, who I've seen recently in a show that is hard to recommend because it's fucking crazy. It's also fairly not safe for work, but it's called Gushing Over Magical Girls. She plays the character Nero Alice in that show. She's not in a whole lot of stuff. She's still very young. She's super young when she was in this movie. But it's a great performance because it has the thing. Yamada Naoko obviously is desiring like these much more kind of raw feeling performances, even from the returning voice actors have modulated their performance, I feel, a little bit to have a little bit more of this kind of raw style that Yamada Naoko has gone for in Tamako Market and Silent Voice also. And I think Sugiura is just really good as Ririka, being this girl who's like a little bit spaced out. She's very sweet. If this was not set in Japan and instead was set in America, I would assume that she'd be high all the time. This just seems to be the way that she naturally is. It's a natural high. But she's just sort of, she just sort of like floats her way through these different little scenes. And And I just love the fact that she plays the oboe, because it's an example of a character that I think when you look at her, you wouldn't assume that's the instrument she'd play, but there's something about the contrast of that I think speaks to the character, that she seems like this weird spaced out girl who's almost high all the time, but is actually like very committed to playing this very difficult instrument, and is actually very like thoughtful and caring about this interaction with one of her senior students. It's just a very vivid character who doesn't have a huge amount of screen time, but is one of what is a very small number of speaking parts in this movie. There are not a lot of characters in this film. And most of the non-main character speaking parts are just a couple of lines. She's definitely our most prominent character here. And I think it's a really fantastic addition that I'm excited to see her continue to be in future stuff. Because having looked up the credit, I know that she is in future stuff as well.
Well, just the genuineness of her character really comes across, and there's a scene where she's asking Nozomi for advice, and she ends it by giving her a hard-boiled egg, which is like so awkward, but also just so cute.
The reveal, the way the shot works out, where like she has Nozomi hold out her hand, and then Ridika's hand comes in over the top and just pulls away. There's just an egg sitting there. Yeah, that's an incredibly funny sequence.
Thomas and I have been on a Danny DeVito kick recently, including episodes of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and the line we always quote to each other from that show is Frank Reynolds saying, "Can I offer you an egg in these trying times?" And it does. I did hear Danny DeVito's voice in that scene, which I did not expect from Ridika in this moment, but she does do a Frank Reynolds and give a hard-boiled egg. The one other thing I wanted to mention about Ridika that I love is in her character design, she's always wearing a uniform that's too big. It's baggy on her. Like the sleeves are too long, so her hands are kind of like half poking out. It's really baggy on her body. Nobody else in the band really looks like that. Like some characters are like visibly skinny under their clothes, but she's just like wearing the wrong size, which gives that sense of she's a little airheaded, but she's also very committed. Like you get the idea that she's going to be pretty good at this at some point. You know, she wants to work with Mizore because she genuinely wants to get better. You know, she's into the reed making and all of that stuff, even though it's hard. And I like her. She's a good kohai.
Absolutely. And she's got, she's got a little yellow bunny ear case on her phone that you see when she is showing her like picture that they took at the pool together. It's and then when she texts the picture to Mizore, it's the sweetest thing in the world, where she texts her like, "Senpai, I love you. You're the best. Thank you so much." And it's like, God, she's such a nice kid.
And I love that picture so much. Like she took it to the point where she's not really in it. It's just like her forehead is in it.
Yeah. I love that scene. That scene also reminds me of something I wanted to talk about, which is the passage of time in this movie is really interesting, because it wasn't quite clear to me just how long what competition are they working towards at the end of the movie, Thomas?
It's the Kansai competition, the second one.
Okay, so it's the Kansai competition. So this is like the first half of the school year or so or whatever. But it takes place over a pretty long period of time for a movie, especially because the show moves pretty slowly. You know, the Kansai competition, that's a full season. But I like how they do it. I like those little jumps. Like that is a very fluid jump, because it goes from Mizore asking Nozomi, "Can I invite people to the pool together?" And Nozomi is very like relieved to see Mizore coming out of her shell. And then we jump to not her asking Ririka, but the aftermath. It's like a month later, and they're talking about this cool day. And you see, what I love is that they jump to what it meant to Ririka, which is Ririka is still going on about this day she got to spend at the pool with her senpai. And even though Mizore is socially awkward, I do think she understands, like, wow, that meant a lot to Ririka here. And it's just, there's things like that where they show the passage of time in this very lyrical fashion that I think is really fluid and cool to see.
Yeah, you also get it with like the book. There's the other like big thing they do, this show the passage of time that Mizore continues to fail to bring this book back to the library, and you have this
favorite minor character in this movie, the bitch librarian who keeps chewing them out.
She's just doing her fucking job. Okay, these delinquent ass kids from the band think that they went to nationals, so they can do whatever the fuck they want. Let me go get Liz and the Blue Bird and keep it out for months at a time. Those books are not your book. They belong to all the students in the school. Okay, what if, I don't know, the literature teacher wants to have students be able to pick a free read book, and they want to be able to read a book for a class project, and I want to do Listen to the Blue Bird, that sounds fun. It's like, too bad. Your Noizaka senpai has it checked out for a fucking year.
Sean, there is no way this has not literally happened to you. Who did this to you? Who hurt you?
It's just, I don't know, it's just a constant struggle of, like, where are the goddamn books from the library? And as an English teacher, that ends up falling on me to remind them constantly to bring your books back, you fools.
Here's the douchiest thing I'm ever going to say on this podcast. I have been a grad student for many years, and we get to keep our books out for literally a full year, and we can renew them at any time. So I have not had to worry about due dates in like a decade. And so when they did that, I went, oh, right, normal people do have to return books. And then I felt really douchey for thinking that.
Yes, well, at least you had, like, an actual exception granting you the ability to keep the books out. It wasn't just that you felt like it, which I do love the detail that Mizore, this just feels so real. She fails to be able to remember to bring the book back. But then there's the part where Nozomi's like, well, I'll just lend the book to you, my book to you. And Mizore's like, no, you can't do that. You can't. That's against the rules. You can't lend out a book that you borrowed to somebody else. I'm like, well, also what's against the rules is keeping the book for like 2 months. But it's so true. Like it makes, it's a real hypocrisy that people would actually have.
So we talked about Ryurika. She's one of the only new voices in the movie. There's one other major one we can talk about. But then I think we also need to just focus on our two leads. So we talked about a little bit in season 2. Sean, what other voices do you want to talk about with this one?
I mean, we could just, like, I do want to just do a quick rundown of our returning characters, because we do have our students from the main show. We've got a few back here. So we have Yuko, who is now the president of the club, which we knew obviously happened at the end of season 2. We actually see her in that role with Natsuki as the vice president. My favorite couple in the series. I love them. They're still at each other's throats constantly. And we learned that Nozomi is now the treasurer as well. So you get a couple of scenes of them all kind of meeting together and doing the club business. And I love that aspect of this movie. I like that it's, the movie gets to exist very much on its own terms. But if you've watched the TV show, it's cool that the movie is set later in the timeline, which I didn't know before watching it. I think I just kind of assumed, oh, it's going to happen like around maybe like it's their side of the story leading up to Nationals or something like that. I didn't, because people describe it as a spin-off movie, which I guess it technically is, but it is also a sequel. It does push the timeline forward, so you get to see our returning characters be a little bit older. They're in a different position now, and you do get little cameos from our main group, the base section from the original show, obviously sans Asuka Senpai, who's graduated at this point, but you do get Kumiko back, you do get Reina, you get one great little scene with Hazuki and Sapphire, where they do their, like, I've never heard of this before, I guess this is the Japanese version of Jinx, but Happy Ice Cream, which I need to look this up, because I wonder if that is a thing, or was ever a thing, or if Sapphire is just lying and manipulating
Thomas,
Hazuki into getting her free ice cream.
Thomas, you lived in Japan for a year. Did this ever happen?
No, I never had an interaction with high school girls wherein we said the same thing and one of them yelled happy ice cream and explained it to me, unfortunately.
Well, I just assume if it's high school girls that adults do it too.
Well, I don't know. I didn't live in Kyoto, I was up in the Tokyo area.
True. Maybe it's a Kansai thing. Yeah. Who knows? But we do get that little scene with them. But the big moment you get with our returning or characters, like the big characters from the original show, is you do have that one scene of Kumiko and Reina in their little shadowy corner of the school doing the duet, just now on trumpet and euphonium, and the two sets of characters watching them play it. And it's such a great little moment that works for the movie on its own, that just showing here's what it's like for two musicians who like mutually love and trust each other to play this piece. Is it the most incredible performance you've ever heard in your life? No, but it is this like real performance of these two people who really care about each other. They're having fun as musicians. It's a thing that clearly Mizore wants from Nozomi. But the other thing I like about that moment being there is it kind of gives the impression that there is a normal episode of Sound Euphonium that has been happening in the background that Mizore is just completely fucking ignorant of because she's so bad at reading this stuff, that in my mind, this is less of, Kumiko never did the thing she did in the book or whatever to mediate this. It's more Mizore is too, too like sort of blind to these things to realize that the entire time Kumiko has probably been trying to get them to practice the solo and overcome whatever their issues are and everything. But to Mizore, that those interactions are not important enough to exist in this movie. They just have happened in the gaps between the library. You know, maybe Kumiko was also somewhere at that pool that day like she was in season 2 and she just isn't in the picture. I like the sense that that is happening in the background. You just get these little tiny snippets of where it vaguely intersects into this film.
Absolutely. And I like that. You know, it's the kind of thing where I don't think they overplay it where it would become distracting if you hadn't seen the show. But if you've seen the show, I like the idea that, yes, there's a normal season of sound euphonium happening in the background that we just don't see, and that's very funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of, there's one other notable new voice here, which is the character voicing Liz and the Blue Bird, which is, I think, a really cool special performance that is also doing a very Ghibli-esque thing. Tell us about this, Sean.
Yes, so Liz and the Blue Bird, the main characters of the storybook sequence, are both voiced by Honda Miyu, who she is not really a voice actor by trade. She, I guess, was a child actor. At the time, she was 14 years old. Now she's just a non-child actor. She's an actor. Who at the time when this happened, she had just had her first starring role in a TV drama, which I assume was kind of like what put her into the radar of like, let's get someone who's not of the voice acting world to play this character, which Yamada Naoko has done before. It is also the thing you get in Ghibli movies and Ghibli-esque movies, things going for that style, not wanting to have just professional voice actors, but have like, you know, that much more raw kind of untrained or unpracticed quality you can get when you have a non-voice actor do this. And Honda Miyu is also just a fascinating person with an absolutely insane career where, you know, when you like look up a person on Wikipedia, it'll say who they are and it'll give you like this person and they're a writer, actor, singer, maybe, right? If they're someone who's had an eclectic career. When you look up her, it's like 8 things because it's like, oh, she's an actor and she's a singer and she does modeling and she's a YouTuber and she's this, that, and the other thing. Oh, and she's also a fucking professional figure skater. Her, along with 4 of her siblings. I'm like, who the hell is this lady who is a professional figure skater with 4 siblings that all of them run a YouTube channel that has 500,000 subscribers? Oh, and she does singing, modeling, and acting on the fucking side. And she does play this character in this movie. You know, not super relevant to just the movie in and of itself, but it's an absolutely insane career if you look up this woman. But for the movie, it's a great performance. And the idea... which in an interview I read, Yamada Naoko said this was like her first idea before they did any casting was, let's have this be both characters played by the same person. I think the idea of having Liz and the Blue Bird both be played by the same actress, who's this kind of untrained young actress who's, you know, 14 years old, honestly, like younger than the characters on the screen are, or at least read to me. Like Liz reads to me as being older than that. Giving this very raw kind of innocent feeling performance, it works so well because I think a big part of the point of Liz and the Blue Bird in the story and how it reflects on Nozomi and Mizore is that everybody is both of these roles, right? In this specific film, it is kind of showing this shift where Mizore is kind of understanding herself as being the Blue Bird, but I also think part of the point of the movie isn't just Mizore is the Blue Bird and Nozomi is Liz. It's all people are both these things and both these kinds of people at different points of their lives in different kinds of relationships. And to me, that's why you want them to both be voiced by the same actress. It allows you to read this sort of universal experience represented by these 2 characters. That's like, I think, a very fundamental thing about human relationships with people, particularly when they're contingent on a hobby or a skill or a profession or something like that, where somebody's like ability to do something and their sort of capacity to perform whatever this thing is comes into play and is part of that relationship. Everybody has been both the Blue Bird. Everyone has been Liz at different points. And I think the way that performance expresses that in the story is really cool.
I'm glad you said that, Sean, because...
Yeah, oh. I'm glad that both of you said that. Happy ice cream.
This was not planned. Thomas, I'll let you go ahead. You're our guest. You explain why you're happy Sean said that.
Well, like sometimes with this show, I'm a little nervous, or not nervous, but I'm thinking like, does this have the same impact on people who haven't lived through something so similar? And that's one of the major takeaways for me is like, there are situations where you're acting out both of these roles in your life. And for me, a lot of them are specifically music related, but I wonder how well that translates to, like, I don't know, whatever the fuck you guys do.
As a teacher, I can read this 100% of, like, there have been times when, like, I feel like I've realized, oh, I'm kind of the bluebird in this relationship, in the sense that this other, maybe younger teacher, or this other, like, I have to think of a specific person when I was getting my license, and realize, like, oh, they think I'm, like, really good at all this stuff for, like, various reasons. And then I've had moments as a, like, professional teacher where I look at someone, and there's, like, a teacher who's older than me, but isn't that much more experienced as a teacher, that I look at him like, how the fuck do you do that? Like, how did you build that relationship? Or how did you come up with the idea for that assignment, or whatever it is? And I just think that that's true of any kind of, whether it's, like, literally a professional thing, or anything that, again, is related to something you do that is passionate. And anything you do that you are passionate about is something that you do in relationship to other people, likely that they are also doing, that those people are likely to be passionate as well. And this dynamic of, when you reach this new threshold, this breaking point where you're, like, ready to move on, or where you're looking up to somebody else that you're kind of supporting as they are moving to some other level, or doing something that you think is incredible that you just can't even touch. I just think, like, everybody at different points in their life exists on that spectrum and can read so much into this relationship dynamic.
Absolutely. And the reason I was happy you said that, Sean, is because I was going to say something similar. And that, you know, if you go into this movie with, you know, just any familiarity with stories or dramaturgy in general, you know that it's not going to be static for the whole 90 minutes, right? You know that it is not going to be, at the beginning, it appears that Mizore is Liz and Nozomi is the Bluebird, and at the end, they are still going to be Liz and the Bluebird. You just know that there's going to be some kind of twist on that. But I like that it is as complicated as it is. It's exactly what you were saying, Sean. It's what you were saying, Thomas. It is not just a direct inversion of that, like, oh no, we were wrong, it was Mizore who was the Bluebird, and it's, like, firmly that. I think the story is about both of them being both parts, and that they have these, it's like the whole question for Mizore is, I can't empathize with the letting her go. And it is realizing that the story is about both of those actions. It is about letting go and being let go. It is also, like, I think the most affecting of the storybook sequences is the one where we see the pain of the Bluebird herself being, like, kind of thrown out of the nest. And I think that's where it also, I think, expands and becomes even more relatable. And they do this in the framing of the movie in several really beautiful ways as well. So at the end of so you have the whole concert sequence or the practice sequence where we get the big solo. Then they have their scene in the science room we've talked about, where they finally have their kind of, you know, come to Jesus moment together, and they kind of understand each other. Then there is a moment that really feels like right out of A Silent Voice or something. This really lyrical, like, 30 seconds that is just two birds up there flying in the sky together. And I love that as a visual piece of storytelling, because that kind of flattens it in a different way. Because neither of those birds are blue. They're against a blue sky. They're a little blue tinted, but they're just two white birds. Neither bird is particularly dominant. At some points, one is flapping more, and then the other is flapping more, and then one is gliding and the other is flapping. There's this dance, there's this stability to the relationship that they have that I think is what it's trying to tell us that Mizore and Nozomi are working towards. And then in the sequence that follows, we talked about this scene earlier too, is this montage that intercuts between Nozomi going towards the college entrance exams and Mizore going more down the oboe path. There's this incredible shot where you have I love how the way it kind of intercuts here is you have the characters doing an action, and it cuts to the other character doing a similar action. There's a lot of match cuts, but they're doing it for different reasons. You know, one is reading music, one is reading out of a college study guide. But you have this one moment where Mizore looks down and sees that drawing in her note paper on the solo you assume Nozomi has sketched in the Bluebird, and basically, saying, good luck with this or whatever, do well with your solo. And then she says, kind of
fly, looks like she says, like, beat your wings is literally what hapatake is, like, to beat your wings.
Okay, so she has that, and then she kind of looks up, but it match cuts to Nozomi looking up, and then we cut out a little bit, and she's in the library framed against the window, and then this bird just flies in from the right of the frame over to the left, and then it seamlessly cuts to Mizore. She's practicing, she's facing a window, and that same bird flies across the frame. And so in that sense, it also stops you from reducing it too much. It's not, oh my god, the bird in the shot with Nozomi, that is the bird she let go, because then we immediately cut to Mizore and there's also a bird there. And it is about that idea that then is kind of resolved with the image of the two colors, the red and blue, mixing, that they have both experienced both sides of the Liz and the Bluebird thing, and that's how they become fuller people. And so that is where, like, just again, dramaturgically, this movie is so smart and it is so good at the kind of thing it is trying to do.
Yeah, all that stuff is incredible. I particularly love the sequence of the two birds, where there's just, it's so elegant at dramatically expressing this idea of that, like, they're coming together, they're drifting apart, one's ahead, one's behind, and it flows like that. And it's like a solid, like, 45 seconds to a minute of just watching that play out, with this relationship between the two birds. And I like it expresses something that I think the movie is getting at, which is what we are seeing in this movie is not the be-all, end-all of Mizore and Nozomi's relationship. Like, once the movie is over, it is not, and that's in Happily Ever After, their relationship is now set in stone. This is what it is for all time. It is a sense of you are getting a glimpse into one important point in the relationship between these two people that is going to continue on, and they're going to drift apart and come together, and it's going to evolve and shift and change over time, just as it has evolved and shifted and changed from what it was in season 2. When we saw them in season 2, they seemed to be best buddies forever and had fully come over their issues or whatever, and it seemed perfect and resolved. And like, clearly that was not the case. Like, clearly there's always going to be something they need to overcome, because their feelings between these two people is so intense. And using this little image of the birds showing that helps you sort of see the complexity and the open-ended nature of what the story is actually trying to be about, not just, I am the blue bird, therefore I should fly, and that's it.
And also the complexities, I think they realize at the end that it's not like Liz is always holding back and the bluebird is only, it's not a purely negative relationship. They both get something out of being both roles, and there's something special and beautiful about that. That even, at the end, when Nozomi realizes, like, my life isn't going to be this way, but there's still something beautiful about the relationship they have.
Yeah.
So what else do we want to say about this movie? I think we've covered most of the major points in it, but Thomas or Sean, what other parts do we want to say before we...
I think a big part, we focused a lot on the Mizore side of things, because I think that's where the movie, like, spends the most amount of time. But I think, for me, the more interesting character is Nozomi, because she is fucking complicated. Because my read on the character changed a lot in this, coming from season 2. But it's all evolves naturally from season 2, where she is such a... I think there's a sense of a difficulty of seeing what does she know is happening and is not letting on that she knows, and what is she actually ignorant of. And like, one place where you see that very specifically is in the ending, where you have their big, like, I love you hug and all that stuff happens. When they're saying the things they love about each other, Mizore mentions all the stuff of, like, you're the one who brought me into the band, like, you've always been there for me, all this stuff. And Nozomi tells her, I don't really remember that. And then once that hug breaks up and then Nozomi starts going home, she flashes back to the moment she saw Mizore. We see it through Nozomi's eyes, of her saying, like, oh, who are you? Like, you don't have a club? You just are in the going home club? Oh, well, why don't you come join band? And it's like, bullshit, you don't remember. Like, it is a hugely important moment in your life as well. And I think it, like, throws into questions a lot of assumptions you have about Nozomi and what she's done, of, like, was she as ignorant as she lets on in season 2 about her choice to quit the band without telling Nozomi? Without telling Mizore, is that a thing that she actually was ignorant of? Or is it a thing that she very intentionally did because she was afraid of telling her friend and was afraid of the consequences of what that would mean? And I think it's like, for me, it's like very much the latter. Nozomi is kind of a very relatable person, but also a kind of fucked up person. Like, a person that makes really rough choices, a person that potentially harms a lot of the people that she's with. Like, Jonathan, there was a point where you said earlier about a scene where Mizore asked to invite Ririka to the pool thing. And you said that, Nozomi's relieved by the fact that Mizore is inviting another person. I don't think that's like really what happens there. Because when Mizore says that, you get this shot of Nozomi, who looks initially actually completely perplexed and like dumbfounded that this has happened. And then a student walks in front of Nozomi's face. And as she walks through with that, there is a wipe cut. And then you see Nozomi actually putting on this smile that was not there before.
And earlier, that's kind of a response to a scene where it's when they're all the like executives of the band are talking, and Mizore is like just plucking away on the piano, and Nozomi says, "Hey, we should go to the festival together," and she invites Yuko and Natsuki there, and she asks Mizore if there's anyone she wants to invite, and when she says no, there's this shot of her hands on the desk. She's like grabbing it, and then she sort of releases them and makes fists and sort of puts them down, and it's like there's a complex emotion there where she's not like angry, but she's definitely like. She has sort of negative feelings towards Mizore in that moment.
Well, I think she's relieved. I think, like, from my read is that Nozomi likes being the person who is in charge. She likes Mizore relying on her, because I think deep down Nozomi the whole time knows how incredible Mizore is, how amazing she is as a musician, how brilliant and talented she is as a person. And someone who is that brilliant and talented relying on you feels really fucking good. And so I think she's afraid of the idea that, oh, we're going to lose. I'm like, this girl is going to go out and realize that she and her life is so much bigger than me. And once she realizes that, where does that leave me? And I think it's, you know, it doesn't make Nozomi a bad person. It's like a very relatable and understandable feeling, but it's a really like kind of gross thing. I think she knows it's gross and she hates that she feels it, but she is so like quietly manipulative of people in this way I find very fascinating. And another character that gets implicated in this is Natsuki, who's a character I love. She's so cool. She's like the coolest person in the band, but it also kind of repaints her a little bit of an enabler because she doesn't challenge Nozomi in these like on the kind of the bullshit that Nozomi's doing. In the way that Yuko does. Like when Yuko hears Nozomi say, "Oh, I'm going to go apply to a music college too," and Mizore is like, "Well, if you're going to apply, then I'll apply." Yuko's like really disturbed by that because it's like, that's not the reason you should apply to music school. Like that's a much more serious decision than that. Whereas like Natsuki wants everyone to be happy and is trying to pave over all of that stuff. And Nozomi's very good at knowing that Natsuki's always going to be in her corner. It's what Natsuki did in season 2. And so she runs to Natsuki and relies on that relationship and is a little bit more cagey around Yuko's. And the best line reading, I think, in this whole movie is Toyama Now, who voices Nozomi. There's the scene where they're all in the little kind of like, I don't know, storage room or something. It's her, Yuko, and Natsuki. And it's after the whole scene with Kumiko has happened. And Nozomi is saying like, well, do I really want to go to music school? And she's being flaky in the way she's always been flaky. You get this great moment where Yuko kind of starts lecturing her, calling her out on all the bullshit that Nozomi's done in season 2 and in this movie. You then get this shot of Nozomi looking, you see her, she starts playing with her nails, and then you get a first-person shot of her playing with her nails. It's then echoed later in the movie where she does a similar thing where she looks down at her feet and starts playing with her feet when Mizore is trying to confront her because Nozomi is this person that doesn't know how to deal with these awkward feelings and wants to try to manipulate the scene to not have this happening. But when she's doing that, Yuko's trying to call her out, and I forget exactly what Yuko says, but Yuko's like says something about like, well, shouldn't you tell Mizore what you're doing here? And then Nozomi looks up her and says, "Nande?" She says, "Why?" But the way that Toyama Now inflects that line, it's loaded with so much meaning with this like, Nozomi knows exactly why she should be telling Mizore all this stuff, and she is challenging Yuko to try to push that point further. It's like, can you push it further? Like, really, like, why? Like, can you do this? Can you push me? And she's trying to sort of put up these walls. And the way that I think Toyama Now is able to express the really thorny kind of gross parts of this character while still making her likable. You still see why everybody likes her. You see why she's this person that can bring the band together. But you see that there is a reason why she quit band in first year, and there's like a reason why she doesn't have the sort of attitude to try to stick through the awkwardness and the difficulties with this stuff. And that's a negative part of the character, and this movie like really digs into that in a way I think is just fantastic.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys are going through all of this because it's very true. I think the most devastating moment in this movie is when Mizore tries to mend the relationship actively. She tries to be the one reaching out, and they're in the hallway, and she comes out and she tries to talk. Nozomi says, "No, I've got to go home." And then Mizore reaches her arms out to do the hug thing that she had seen earlier in the movie that is ultimately resolved on the other end of the movie. And there is a shot that I considered using as the art for today's show, and then I thought, no, this would be too fucking sad. But it is of her with her arms outstretched and Nozomi looking back and then just going, "Next time, maybe," and walks away. And it is maybe the saddest thing we've seen in any KyoAni show. It's so brutal. It's so sad. And I think there is... And I don't think the meaning of that moment is, wow, Nozomi is mean. It's that, wow, Nozomi doesn't want to grapple with what she's feeling, right?
Yes.
Like, she really doesn't want to grapple with this. And that is a lot of this, is that I think you start the movie thinking Mizore is in a weaker or more submissive stance. But, like, Mizore has a real inner power. She works through this stuff before Nozomi does. She's the one she flies free in the big performance scene, and then they have their, heart-to-heart, that even then, Nozomi doesn't fully own up to what she is feeling. Nozomi is really, really scared of that intimacy in a way that Mizore is scared of intimacy in general, but she's willing to push through that discomfort for this one person. And Nozomi is willing to have shallow relationships with a lot of people, but she's not ready to push through to a really meaningful relationship with this one person.
Yeah, and it's just such a rich character to explore, because it's kind of an unpleasant reality of how most people are in these kinds of relationships.
And like musically, what Nozomi realizes at the end, sort of after they sort of resolve things, is the most she can do and the most meaningful thing she can do is just support Mizore in the solo. And that's kind of a sort of a reflection of something that Mizore says is her fear at the beginning of the movie. Is Nozomi says, "I'm excited for this performance," and Mizore thinks to herself, "I don't ever want that to happen." But the reason she's afraid of it is actually the reason that Nozomi is so hesitant to do all these, to really, resolve this stuff, is because that's sort of the end for her. That's the ultimate thing she can do in this band relationship she has with everyone, and especially with Mizore, is just be the supporting person and accept that she's not going to be a professional musician. She's not going to be like the main heroine in this kind of story. That I think, every high schooler definitely sort of wants to be special like that.
Yes, they do. As a high school teacher, I can tell you, every high school thinks that they are special. They think they're the main character of the world.
And that kind of ties back, like, in episode 8 of season 1, when Reina says, "I'm playing trumpet because I want to be special." And then Kumiko later, she says, "I want to be special too." And through this whole movie, like with even Niyama Sensei only really pays attention to Mizore because she recognizes how special she is. But then one of the most meaningful things that Mizore can say when she actually does finally get to hug Nozomi is she says, "You're really special to me."
Yeah, and I do want to focus a little bit on the Niyama Sensei piece here, because I think like it's so interesting the way in which you see very quietly Nozomi has started to read that, like, like this kind of hold I have on Mizore is starting to slip bit by bit. And it happens with like Niyama Sensei stuff, which a lot of those scenes are communicated in these moments where they see each other through the multiple windows across the two wings of the school, which are really great, interesting shots. And like the one with the beam of light that gets like shot between the two of them and stuff. But Niyama Sensei keying in on Mizore and spending all this time on Mizore. And you have multiple moments where you see Nozomi looking over, and you get this focus on her gaze, looking at Niyama Sensei with Mizore, and Nozomi. It's again all like communicated purely visually, but it's this quiet jealousy and this quiet need. That's like, I want to be that. I want to have the teacher pay special attention to me. And you have this very brutal shot of her stopping Niyama Sensei after that one little part of practice in the hallway in this like long shot, and it holds there for almost a full minute of her asking Niyama Sensei, like, hey, or her not even asking her, just telling her, hey, I'm applying to a music school too. And Niyama Sensei's like, well, that's great. I'll be here to support you. And then she walks away, and you just hold on that for a while in this big empty hallway. It's so fucking brutal. And it's one of those places where it's like, you know, it makes me think a little bit about being a teacher and how perceptive students are to like favoritism, because it's so true. And it's something you have a teacher, you have to be so conscious of like, am I over focusing on this student or this group of students? Because students are super hypersensitive to where is the teacher's attention going and who is it going towards, whether that's in a positive or a negative sense. And it's like Niyama, one thing as a teacher she needs to learn how to do is to be more open to working with all the students of whatever skill level they are at, because she is over prioritizing Mizore. And a lot of the sort of more dramatic shit that happens at the end of this movie could have maybe been softened or eased over if Niyama Sensei had a better sense of how the students are feeling and how they're interacting. But this like very cold way she says like, well, that's great, I'll help you out if you need it, let me know. And then she just walks away, and then the next day she's like sitting right next to Mizore, like pointing at the music and chatting over all this stuff. It's like, oh man, that's brutal.
Absolutely. And you know, as we're talking about all this and just reflecting on what a impossibly rich central character dynamic there is in this movie, I also do just want to, you know, put this up next to what Thomas called the prelude to Liz and the Bluebird arc in season 2. Because Thomas, earlier on you said, and I think you were just kind of being a little pithy here, that I didn't like that, but I did like those episodes. I think they're very good. I said that at the time. I don't think they were my favorite part of it, and I thought like the pacing was slightly off to me, and I actually think this movie helped me understand my thoughts on this a little more. And this is also just where I want to sing the praises of the cinematic form, because I think like doing this story where you have these two characters and you do it in a 90-minute movie and you sit down and you do the whole thing and the pacing you have to build is 90 minutes, I think is so essential. I don't think this story, even if you had a lot of the same animation quality and everything else, if you did it in 3 or 4 episodes of TV, would be as powerful. I think one thing that maybe breaks it up for me or distances me a little bit in season 2 is that it is all interpolated through Kumiko, and you do have to have episodic breaks where you have to kind of resolve and start up again a couple of times. That creates a little bit of repetition that I don't think the movie has to deal with. And I think it being concentrated in the movie form here, and it is the purpose of the 90-minute movie, is how it's able to do it. Like, this was the right way to tell this story. And I'm not necessarily saying the couple episodes of season 2 were the wrong way to tell that story, but it is part of why I think I respond so strongly to this, is that you are so in that subjectivity. It is so laser focused on finding all these interesting cinematic ways to depict this central dynamic, and it's able to do it in this tight 90-minute package. You know, this is a really smart piece of storytelling in the form that they have chosen.
Yeah, I would broadly agree that I think like the way the movie explores the relationship is fantastic. Although like I guess I never really felt those pacing issues for season 2, because what season 2 is doing is using that as a small fragment to explore this larger issues and larger ideas that Kumiko is going through as a protagonist. So, because I think that is very effective televisually, because you've got the camp that happens in the middle, you've then also got that all leading up to the Kansai competition. So I think they're very different kinds of stories, even though they're both focusing, broadly speaking, on the same kind of relationship between the two characters. They're going at it at such different directions. I think like the movie does it perfectly as a movie. I think the TV show does it fantastically as a TV show.
Thomas, do you want to call me a cannibal again?
I said I wasn't going to do that this week.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no name calling.
That's a next week thing.
I'll do that off the air, yeah. Okay.
Well, you do that every day. You call me serial killer, cannibal, kidnapper, all these things.
Well, I mean, he doesn't tell that to you. He's trying to tell it to the cops to get them to finally stop you. It's not happening yet.
We'll get there.
All right. What else do we want to say about this movie before we start wrapping up?
Hashimoto Sensei's got some great outfits. You get just a couple of scenes in this movie, but I love his fucking shirts. I particularly love the red Hawaiian shirt with the yellow pineapples on them. It's just every time he's on screen, I'm like, hell yeah, Hashimoto Sensei. I need to go to this dude's tailor. Like he's just got a fucking look that he has committed to.
I want to talk about music just a little bit more.
All right.
Go for it.
Well, for one, just earlier, we were talking about the difference, how clearly different this is aesthetically from the rest of Sound Euphonium. Musically, it also is too, in that the underscore, or the non-diegetic music, it doesn't use strings at all, actually. It only uses the band instruments, including harp and piano. So you do get some of the string-like stuff in there. And it's, I mentioned earlier, it's scored much differently. It's much more direct, which, the movie lets you do as well, is that you get to write unique cues for every moment of the movie that needs music, rather than being restricted by, having sort of a set amount of music you have time to do for TV. But also, the way that the Listen the Bluebird piece represents the story, I think, is really powerful. And in the scene at the end, really close to the end, where they're doing the rehearsal, Mizore asks, can we do movement 3? We talked about it a little bit earlier. That is just such this cool, like, really interesting depiction of this moment you get really, really rarely when you're doing large ensemble music like that, where basically the whole group has this out-of-body experience. It might be stemmed from, like in this case, someone's just playing really well in a way that sort of unlocks the whole point of the music. It might be stemmed from, like, someone's comment, like if the instructor's really, really good at their job, they might point out something that the band isn't thinking about that gets everyone sort of on the same page, and they get to do this thing where they feel really together for the first time. And really, I think there's a part in the solo where the oboe is doing this descending line that's like ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's sort of, to me, like, it's sort of paired with this picture of a bird stopping. It's not flapping its wings anymore. It's just sort of gliding down. And then the flute echoes that right after, and that's when Nozomi cries. And I think that's just, like, musically, to me, that's really spot on, that, like, Mizore gets to fly free, and Nozomi starts, and then she realizes she can't, and she has to stop. And there's that kind of, I think that's the best example of it, but there's that kind of thing throughout the score to this movie where the details are just so, like, minutely accurate to the emotions that you don't get in, like, any movie from Hollywood anymore. You don't really have time to do in an anime because you're often not writing cues for specific points. Sometimes there are special things like that. But that's just the kind of attention to detail that the music of this movie has that I think really takes it from great to excellent.
Yeah, and it's I think one of those things that's, like, mind-blowing about it is also that it is that they designed the whole thing. Like, you only hear this one fragment of it, but they created the entire song and all of its movements. And I think there's just something about, like, the commitment to that. Because it's true about the show as well, where if there's, like, you hear 30 seconds of this other school playing this piece over the TV of an episode in the show, if you go to the soundtrack, there's a whole 10-minute fucking performance of that entire piece of music that they just put this one little snippet up. And so I think there's just this really commitment to, here is what this music means and how it reflects on the characters and their emotions in such a minute way, as you're pointing out. And then obviously it all comes together specifically in that scene so powerfully.
Yes, Thomas, I'm very glad you are here to talk about music because you're able to put a point on it that I think neither of us are quite capable of doing. And of course, that's not necessarily necessary for everything we talk about here, but for Sound Euphonium, it sure as shit is. Anyway, I think we probably want to end today by maybe just having a more general conversation with Thomas about Sound Euphonium, about any other, like, pieces of the show we wanted to ask him about or anything else he wanted to say while we have him here. But is there anything else specifically we wanted to say about Liz and the Bluebird before we do that?
The last proper shot of the movie is fucking incredible, where Nozomi turns around and you just get this shocked look on Mizore's face and you never find out what was that. Like, did Nozomi say something insane? Does she turn around and, like, she's making a funny face? Like I love this, like, incredibly weird, totally inexplicable moment It's such a great thing. And it's such a great moment to then give you the word disjoint and then scratch out the word dis on it and say joint, because it is for the viewer, it's such a disjointing moment because you are so removed from like, what the fuck is happening? Like, why is Mizore making that expression? Because it's them too. It's not us. It's not for us anymore. It's such a great little weird way to end the movie. I love it.
Absolutely.
I think the animation is excellent as usual, except Taki-sensei kind of can't conduct very well.
Is that a new thing? I feel like I don't know a lot about conducting, but I feel like that's an issue with the show also.
It's like the only inaccuracy. Usually he's more or less in time. In this one, he kind of just, I don't know, it's like his arms are just sort of moving freely away from the thing.
I noticed he flourished a little more, like the arms felt less precise, and I wonder if it's just kind of where this as a different designer and animation director kind of took it. But yeah, I mean, he's hard to animate his conducting anyway, because he conducts without the baton, which would be something to kind of weigh you in the shot, I imagine, if you're animating, but it's even harder when it has to all be through the hands.
Yeah, I don't like, from what I see of him in this movie and also Our Promise, it's like, I don't know if he should have this job, actually. He doesn't seem very good at conducting. But, that's a small issue.
But, like, I almost, like, I kind of read it as, like, legitimately, I think that's kind of part of the character. Like, he is, at sometimes he feels like a great teacher, but he's also a bit buffoonish. Like, he also is, like, there are so many things that he's so kind of, like, blind to, and he is a novice teacher, right? It's like, this is not... I don't know, like, what his experience is conducting outside of this. I don't know if they ever, like, explain more fully specifically what his whole background is with music. We know that, I think he played the trumpet, right? I think we kind of know that through Reina. But, yeah, like, I think it is I kind of read it as almost like a thing with the character. He's very, maybe overly expressive with his hands. He's got a lot of fixation with his hands. He does a lot of hand movements, but he's maybe not actually good at conducting.
Conducting is hard, to be fair, even for really talented musicians.
So is playing any instrument, It takes
All right,
practice.
Thomas says, this is pure mercenary. I love it. Thomas, what else did you want to say about the world of sound euphonium? Or Sean, what else did you want to ask while we have him here?
Yeah, I'd love to take questions. I do think it's a really magical world. It really gets me fascinated into the difference between, like, band, which is a class in the U.S., versus band, which is usually just a club.
Yeah, I guess, can you expand a little bit on that with your understanding? Because that's just the thing that I'm, like, fascinated with, of, like, and I know that obviously you were not a band high school student in Japan, so I don't know how much of the difference you can explain, but what is to you, like, the fundamental difference with how these kinds of programs work in America versus what you understand how they work in Japan?
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, it's, band is an elective class usually in the US. So what they're doing with this sort of competition-focused club is actually more similar to my experience with marching band, which was like the extracurricular band you would do that was, much more focused on competition. And then when the competition was over in October, marching band was over.
And was also after school. It wasn't part of your school day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that actually is a good comparison, at least from my point of view, because you get the people that sort of win every year, and that's their goal, is to make it to state every year. And then, like, one year, our goal was always just to make it to finals. We were never in contention really for the top spots. And my sophomore year, we didn't make it to finals, so, like, that heartbreak is very real. But that's just marching band, which is pretty different. Like, there's the marching scene or episodes in the first season where they're doing the Sunrise Fest, and they practice for like one day and they know how to parade march. And I'm like, I don't know if they would be able to do that after like one day, even if they spent, into the evening on it. They also, like, they don't have marching instruments except for the sousaphones, which are the tubas that wrap around you so you can carry them. But, like, marching with a French horn or a euphonium is also really difficult. Also, usually you play an instrument that's more like a trumpet, just a lot bigger, so it's just out in front of you. Anyway, those differences aren't important, but that's marching. So what was your question, Sean?
Yeah, I guess, because my question was just, like, what do you think are those major differences between the Japanese programs, as you understand it, and the American programs? Because, like, from, as not as a music teacher, but as someone who is in high school, right, we do have, like, music programs are a class, and it's like you do have extracurricular elements to them, but you also have all these people are taking this class and they have specific class time associated with it. And I just kind of find it this ties into my question with like Taki Sensei is like, is he, because they call him Taki Sensei, but they always use the word Komon to refer to him, which would mean like club advisor. And you also have like Matsumoto Sensei, who is there, who we know is their homeroom teacher, who's like a full-time teacher at the school.
Yeah.
Do you have any knowledge, like what the fuck is Taki Sensei's like literal full-time job?
So, not really. In I've only watched one episode of season 3, and he's introducing himself to everyone, and he does say, "You might see me around in music classes," and that like blew my mind because I thought there weren't any music classes, and that's why they had the club. My understanding is that Matsumoto is the club advisor because every club needs an advisor who is a teacher. Like that was a point in K-On! Is like
Yes.
Their advisor was already advising another club, so that was a big drama. But then I assume also in addition they hired someone who can actually conduct the band because, Matsumoto probably, I don't know if she teaches, she's homeroom.
She does not seem,
something.
she didn't seem like she was actually a music person.
Yeah,
Like she just seems like, as you say, she's the teacher at the school who's in charge of the club, which is also true for an American school. Like students need to have some teacher that is present, or someone, an adult must be in the room to make sure they do not all kill each other. That's like 90% of the job.
But like in band, it's a music teacher. Like they're probably not teaching anything else. If it's a really underfunded school, which there are a lot of, they might, go teach like English or something too. Not to insult English.
No, but no, it's true. Like, lots of schools will have just a dedicated music teacher, but sometimes the music teacher will also have to get like double certified in some other area, maybe math or whatever.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons, it's not just conducting, it's also you have to know enough about every instrument to be able to tell people how to play it, especially if you're like, in America, usually you wouldn't start playing in high school, you'd start playing in middle school or the last couple years of elementary school. So the people that go to teach that have to be really focused on the fundamentals of every instrument and a little less focused on conducting, just because you're not going to do anything super complicated with that group anyway. But then it seems like there's, and I did get the sense from some of the people in Japan that I talked to that were in high school, is if they start playing an instrument, they might just start in high school and then they have to kind of learn probably more from other students than from the teacher. Unless they happen to have specialists, like he does bring in the percussion and the woodwind specialist later. But the sense I get from the show and from, again, just sort of the club culture that I was able to glean from my time there is it's a lot more student-driven than it is here. Like there's a student president of the club and, all the executives, obviously, who are somewhat in charge of it. And then Taki Sensei is kind of just there as the overall like leader of the band, but not necessarily always the number one person.
Yeah, you get that sense in the show, and I think it's reflected in other elements of Japanese culture of allowing more independent authority for not just like students, but for young people in general, whereas American culture has swung so hard in the other direction of like, you cannot leave these students unsupervised for a second. Like, you must have an adult in the room 100% of the time, and the room must be physically locked in case a man with a gun enters the school. Like, right? Like, the way that education has moved in America is so against the idea of student autonomy that it's just like, it's fascinating to see something where you have Haruka in season 1 and 2, the club president, seemingly having a lot of like power over the full club and like what people do and helping run things when the teacher's not there. Whereas like that is a pretty alien concept to me as a English teacher, but also as a debate coach in America.
Yeah, and like they do some things on their own too. Like they do the performance out in front of the school all on their own. So that means they have to practice for that and plan that and get the music all on their own. And that's just something you wouldn't really do here.
What is your favorite detail in the show that like lines up with your experience as a band person, as a music person, or plot point, or however you want to answer that question?
It actually is the moment towards the end of this movie where they have that sort of out-of-body like group experience, because there was like one major time. It basically happens like once a year or something like that, but then there was one major time that sort of happened in my time in high school that was really meaningful. And like, it's really difficult to capture because it's really difficult to even describe and then like, get through the meaning of like what triggers it and what does it mean for everyone. For me, it was like a performance it wasn't a competition. It was basically an exhibition for CMEA, which is the Music Educators Association conference. And we had brought in a composer of a piece, and I had talked to him about how his music was really meaningful to me. When our dad died, I was sort of listening to his music a bit, and I told him that. And then he sort of, before we played this piece at this exhibition kind of thing, he sort of told a story about it to the audience and how much that meant to him. And like something about the piece we were playing sort of clicked before we played. And it just, I don't think it sounded all that much different, but it felt different for everyone who was playing and everyone who was listening. And, just really special moments like that are hard to come by, and I assume hard to come up for in stories and stuff.
Well, it's where I think you get the real sense that Takeda Sensei, who writes these books, lived this. Like, there's a real sense that this comes from experience, and it is not just, spinning out of her imagination or going out and researching how this worked. There is a sense that this all comes from someplace that's very genuine, which I think does separate this from other shows with a similar subject matter to some degree.
So I know you have your disagreements with Jonathan on some of the season 2 stuff, but was there anything else that, because you've listened to both of our podcasts for season 1 and 2, is there anything you felt like we missed or you like really disagreed with our takes on anything?
I think you guys talk, and it's in there, the sort of romantic nature of the relationship between Kumiko and Reina. And like, I think that's there, but then the relationship they sort of settle on is like romance is at one tier, and then their relationship is sort of above that. So they've sort of like overshot it, and if they're not, they might be interested in other people. But like, sort of one of the major themes I think of the show is like motivation and reason for doing this. Like, why would you sit in a room, you spend basically all your free time not studying and not doing schoolwork, just like playing this instrument just on one song for like a whole year. And it's like, why would you even, what's the point of that? Like, it's fun, but it's not that fun. So then like having like this person who sort of inspires you, I think is one of the things about their relationship that's really cool. And it's also the relationship between Mizore and Nozomi. Even, despite their turbulence here. But, so I think sort of like people finding their motivation in the show is really interesting. And that's one thing where Reina's not in season 2 very much, because she kind of has it for a while until it kind of shifts, but like it's kind of settled for her for the most part. So I'm sort of interested to see in season 3 and their third year how that changes for them. Another theme that I think is really powerful is sort of just failure and either moving on from it or sort of recovering from it. Like, Hazuki doesn't get a lot to do in season 2 because she's not in the competition group anymore, but she is still this really important character who, like, she's just as dedicated as everyone else, and her reward is different. So like how she deals with that, I think, is really interesting, and also very true of certain things that happen in high school band. Is sometimes you just like, you don't get to do the things that you wanted to do, even if you're a senior or something. And then like, what does that look like for you then?
Yeah, I love Hazuki, even though she's in the background, particularly in season 2. But you get that big, the kind of the OVA episode for season 1, where you get that whole competition from her perspective, and you do just get those key moments. Like I think of like in season 2 of her coming up with the salute thing. It's just like, I don't know why we're doing this, but it just makes it feel important. And she just starts saluting everybody. And it's like, I love in season 2, that's like a slow tick in the last couple episodes that like everybody kind of starts doing, even some of the background characters, you'll see a little shot where they start saluting. Yeah, I like that element of where, there's something about the culture of being part of this bigger group, even if you're not doing the music. And I think that's part of like Nozomi's whole motivation as well. Is just wanting to be a part of this thing with all these people coming together as one big unit. Even if you're not playing the music, you're still part of this bigger organism of the concert band. And there's a sense of belonging there that I think these characters find. And it's cool to see that expressed in the show.
One other thing I want to talk about is just the euphonium in general. I think it's a very... I don't know how much of this was like part of the decision to focus the show on a euphonium player. I know the author was sort of thinking of a different instrument maybe at some point. Is that right?
Yes. Her original idea was she was going to have it be trumpet because that's like the big star kind of instrument. But she herself, Takeda Sensei, played euphonium when she was in band. And so she felt like it was a more interesting thing to go for this instrument that if you're not a part of that world, you may, like me, not even know fucking exists. Because I had no idea what a euphonium was before I heard of an anime called Sound Euphonium and looked it up. But I think it comes a little bit from her own experience and wanting to go for something that feels like it grabs someone's attention. Like, the sound trumpet, everyone knows what that is. Sound euphonium, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, you also get to do the UFO puns in Japanese, so that's fun.
Yes.
Just some fun facts about the euphonium, though, because why not? So it's a really unique instrument, actually, in music. It's one of the newer brass instruments. It's actually not an instrument that's ever really in a symphony orchestra, which means that if you want to be a professional euphonium player, your opportunities are uniquely limited. You can't really do jazz. Like saxophones are also not usually in symphony orchestra, but they can do jazz. Every other instrument can be in a symphony orchestra. All the wind instruments can be in bands. There aren't as many professional bands in the U.S. Most of the professional bands are like military bands, and those are really good jobs. So that would be like your only opportunity really to be a professional euphonium player, if that's all you played. It's also this unique instrument. There's two types of brass instruments. There's cylindrical instruments and conical instruments. The cylindrical instruments are the trumpet and the trombone, basically. Their bore, the inside of the instrument, is the same diameter for the most part until the end, and then it flares out for the bell. And they have this sort of harsher sound. It's a little shorter, more aggressive. And then the conical instruments, they sort of steadily get wider and wider throughout. So that's the horn or the French horn and the tuba, and then also the euphonium. And they have this much sweeter sound. That's why like the French horn gets a lot of solos in film music. It's like the Star Wars instrument, for Luke's theme. And tuba would also get more solos were it not so damn low, and that's why the euphonium exists, because it's basically a smaller tuba, which makes it a really unique instrument because it's the same range as the trombone effectively, which plays with a slide, but it sounds more like a tuba. So that's just some fun facts because that means the euphonium in band music gets to do actually a lot of roles for where it is as sort of a lower instrument. Sometimes it plays with the woodwinds like the bass clarinet. Sometimes it plays with the low brass like the tubas and the trombones, which might have completely different parts anyway. So it is a really interesting instrument that's sort of like the potential of it has not been realized as fully as other instruments. And I just think that's interesting.
Why is Asuka's euphonium silver and Kumiko's gold?
Preference. There are usually like personally I kind of like the look of silver brass. Some people might prefer the way that the brass alloy sounds versus the silver. Most people I think just do it for aesthetics though, is like either the instrument maker that they like happens to make it in a certain color and that's what they get, or they get a better deal on one because they're already tens of thousands of dollars potentially. So if you can find a cheaper one that's gold but you want it silver, maybe that might be the deciding factor.
Could you paint it, or would that ruin the sound?
You could not just fucking paint an instrument. No, don't.
I think I knew that. I just wanted to ask a really dumb question because I thought that would be fun.
Yeah.
When you were in high school, did a member of your band ever have their mom slap them in the faculty office in front of everybody?
No one's parent, to my knowledge, ever slapped them. There were fights between band members that I saw.
Oh, yeah.
Like I said, I was...
Tell us this. Yeah.
Well, I was in the clarinet section, so this never really happened to me, but there was a specific euphonium girl who was pretty good at euphonium, but also really a drama queen, so some people really disagreed with her. She got into a bit of a slap fight with another girl. That was interesting.
Girl fights are the worst. As a teacher who has broken up multiple fights before, you don't want to break up a girl fight. it's dirty, it's nasty. They're going for hair. They're fucking clawing at each other with nails. Like legitimately, it's kind of, I know it's kind of a stereotype. It's fucked up. Like boy fights, it's like they shove each other, and maybe if it gets really intense, they'll actually throw a punch or two. But it's like it usually will end with like some shoving and then throwing the other kid to the ground, and then it's over. With girl fights, you have to like disentangle them from each other. Like they need to invent like a tool to allow you to do it. So this is not a band. This is just teenagers fighting each other. It's a thing, and it fucking sucks.
All right. Well, I think think we can probably wrap up for today. Here's one other little exercise I wanted to do, Sean. I have been, since this is the last episode where we're going to be talking about the work of Yamada Naoko for this season. I'm sure we'll meet her again someday on Japanimation Station. Yeah. I have been going through.
She will do episodes and some other things we'll watch, but this is the first, like, her as the primary director.
Yes, so this is her last major overall project. I have been going through, I have on my Letterboxd profile, running lists of the top 10 films of like every year. And sometimes I go back and update those when I see a movie that I'm like, this probably was in the top 10 of the year it came out. And I have been doing that for her movies. All 4 have broken into the top 10s of the individual years. I thought I'd quickly report on where I put them. K.O. the movie, by far the hardest one to place because it is the least, like, on its own of a... Do you know what I mean? Like, it's the least standalone.
Yeah, you have to watch the TV show to watch K.O. the movie, yeah.
I did still... 2011 also is an extraordinary year for movies. I put it in at number 8 that year, between the Muppets reboot and the Nicholas Winding Refn film Drive with Ryan Gosling, of which it is very different.
Be a great movie night. Watch those 3 movies.
Yeah, are you saying it's Drive, then K.O., then Muppets, or Muppets, then K.O., then Drive?
Muppets, then K.O., and then Drive. Drive was number 7. Now, I'd have, again, this is like off the cuff. This is not, I have watched all of these movies back to back and deeply thought about it. For 2014, which is Tamako Love Story, 2014 is one of the best years for movies in my life. I actually have that one as a top 20 list. But Tamako Love Story is a great movie. I put that all the way up at number 4. Right above a movie we talked about, Whiplash. I put Tamako Love Story 1 above that. And then The Grand Budapest Hotel was above that. And then Under the Skin and Inherent Vice. 2014 was a fucking crazy year. That's a great year. But Tamako Love Story, easily a good enough movie to be in the top 5. A Silent Voice, this was super easy. 2016, that's number 1. There's no question. And 2016 had 2 or 3 movies that I think were on my best of the decade list. So that's no small thing. But A Silent Voice is a real fucking masterpiece. So that's easy.
Yeah, I mean, you have to reissue your 200 reviews book.
I will.
Like, we got to change this. We got to put all this Yamada Naoko in there.
Indeed. And then for 2018, which is Liz and the Bluebird, number 2, I did have one movie above it, which is the Aretha Franklin documentary Amazing Grace. Now, that is an interesting one that you can actually kind of qualify whether that's even a 2018 movie, because it's a movie assembled from footage from like 40 years ago that just never got released. So there's disagreements. But number 1 fiction movie I have that year, that was also, though, an extraordinary year for animation. That is also the year of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Maquia, the first Mari Okada movie, and Dragon Ball Super Broly, which would be a weird double feature with Liz and the Bluebird. But there you go. I did also throw A Silent Voice into my best of the decade list for that decade at number 5, right next to The Tale of the Princess Kaguya. So my point is, Yamada Naoko, one of the best directors of the 2000s, and I think maybe the best debut director of the 2010s, if you are talking about someone who made their feature directorial debut in the 2010s, because her first movie is 2011. I don't immediately think of anyone who would be higher than that.
Yeah, I mean, she's a fantastic director. As we're wrapping up here, I just realized I have another question, not band related, but Yamada Naoko related for Thomas. Thomas, have you watched Tamako Market?
Yes.
What are your feelings on Tamako Market?
Oh, it's great. I liked it more than Jonathan. I was going to say that's the place where...
Thank you.
Yeah. His shortcomings with... Yeah, anyway.
What did you think of Tamako Love Story?
I just wanted... we don't even need to go there. We just can leave it at Tamako Market, the TV show that Jonathan despises with every fiber of his being, and that Thomas and I are right in thinking it's just a fantastic work of art.
It's extremely charming.
Okay. Is there anything you think Sean is wrong about, just while we're doing this, that we can just shit on Sean for a second? Or is he always right?
I don't... No, fuck no. But nothing specific comes to mind.
Yeah, maybe I am always right then, if nothing specific comes to mind.
Maybe I'll write in sometime and talk about all the time Sean's been fucking wrong.
All right. Well, that'll never happen because I've never been wrong. Next time on our Kyoto Vacation, we will be kind of wrapping up. I don't know, maybe wrapping up this part because Sound Euphonium Season 3 is still going. We will tell you what we're doing with that at the end of next episode, probably. But next episode, we will be wrapping up what is the only, as of now, fully finished piece of Sound Euphonium that's not connected to Season 3. This is Sound Euphonium, the movie. Our promise, a brand new day. Check it out next time on Japanimation Station's Kyoto Vacation.
ずだから夫婦として